There is a moment in every auction room when the silence means money. Logan Mercer had learned to read that silence the way some men read weather. But standing in Bay 7 of the Sterling Auto Compound on a gray Thursday morning in October, watching a burned, blackened wreck get wheeled past him on a flatbed dolly, what Logan felt wasn't the particular silence of money. It was something older and more stubborn, the silence of a secret. 32 years old, grease still under his fingernails from a job he'd finished at midnight, Logan watched that ruined Porsche roll by and felt his stomach drop in a way he couldn't explain. Everyone else in the room looked through it. He couldn't stop looking at it. That feeling would cost him everything, and it would save him just the same. If you're watching this, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one goes all the way. The Sterling Auto Compound sat on 12 acres of industrial flatland on the western edge of Cleveland, Ohio, sandwiched between a rail freight corridor and a stretch of Route 42 that nobody drove unless they had to. From the outside, it looked like every other commercial warehouse complex in that part of the city. Corrugated metal siding, faded signage, chain-link fencing with security cameras bolted to the posts at 10-foot intervals. Nothing about the exterior suggested that inside those walls, on any given auction week, you might find a 1963 Ferrari GTO, a pre-war Bugatti, or a first-generation Ford GT40 with racing provenance that made serious collectors go quiet and reach for their phones. That was the Sterling difference. Victoria Sterling had built it that way deliberately. Logan Mercer had heard the name before he ever stepped through the compound's employee entrance. Everybody in the collector car world had heard the name. Victoria Sterling was 30 years old, which was the fact that most people led with when they talked about her, as though youth were the interesting part of her story, rather than the company she'd grown from a regional auction house into something that pulled buyers from Tokyo, Dubai, and London. Her photograph appeared in trade publications and business magazines with a regularity that Logan had noticed without particularly caring about. He was a mechanic. He worked on cars. What billionaires did with their money was not his professional concern. What was his professional concern, on this particular Thursday morning, was a temporary job that paid $40 an hour and offered him 2 weeks of guaranteed work during a stretch when his regular shop, Denson's Automotive on West 65th, had gone quiet while Danny Denson recovered from knee surgery. $40 an hour was real money when you had a 6-year-old daughter to feed, a used Chevy truck that needed new brake rotors, and a landlord who accepted late rent exactly once before he started the paperwork. Logan had gotten the call from a staffing agency that handled labor placement for the automotive industry. Sterling Auto needed mechanical labor for their fall auction. Guys who could move cars, do basic condition assessments, assist with staging. It was grunt work dressed up in a polo shirt. Logan had done worse. He showed up at 6:45 on Monday morning, signed his paperwork at the employee entrance, collected his Sterling Auto staff badge and his navy polo, and spent the first 2 days exactly where the floor supervisor, a round-faced man named Gerald Potts, told him to spend them, moving vehicles from the receiving bay to the storage floor, checking tire pressure, wiping down interiors, and staying out of the way of the appraisers. The appraisers were easy to identify. They wore better shoes than everyone else and carried iPads and spoke to each other in the shorthand of men who considered themselves irreplaceable. The lead appraiser was a man named Clifton Hargrove, mid-50s, silver hair combed with precision, a sport coat that probably cost more than Logan's monthly rent. Hargrove ran the appraisal team with the particular authority of someone who had been told he was brilliant often enough to believe it completely. Logan learned quickly that the hierarchy at Sterling Auto was rigid and unspoken and enforced without anyone having to say a word. The appraisers appraised. The floor staff moved things. Questions that crossed those lines were not welcomed. He kept his head down. He did his job. He watched. The burned Porsche arrived on Wednesday afternoon, strapped to a flatbed truck that pulled into the receiving bay around 2 o'clock. Logan was in the bay at the time, helping another temp named Darius stack equipment crates against the far wall, and he saw it come in. His first thought was, somebody had a very bad day. The car was a 911 body style, or had been once. Now it was a ruin. The front hood had warped from heat and was partially collapsed. The windshield frame was twisted, the glass long gone, the cavities where windows had been caked with soot and oxidized residue. The paint, or what remained of it, had bubbled and peeled and blackened until the body panels looked like burned skin. The interior was gutted, seats incinerated down to bare metal springs that had partially melted. The wheels were still present, surprisingly, though the tires were carbon black circles of fused rubber. Darius looked at it the way you'd look at roadkill. "The hell is that doing here?" he said. "Someone's problem," Logan said. He meant it as a passing observation. A joke, almost. But he kept watching the car as the flatbed crew unstrapped it, as the compound's tow equipment positioned it, as it got wheeled through the bay doors and into the far corner of the storage floor, where Hargrove's assistant, a young woman named Priya, attached an orange low-value tag to what remained of the door handle. Something about it nagged at him. He tried to ignore it. He went back to the crates. He helped Darius finish the stack, clocked out for lunch, ate a sandwich in his truck in the parking lot, and called his daughter. Lily Mercer was 6 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and Logan's stubborn mouth, and she was currently living with Logan's mother, Carol, in the house on Denison Avenue where Logan himself had grown up, because the apartment Logan rented had no second bedroom and a building manager who did not want children on the property, and Logan hadn't yet found a way to fix that particular problem. It was one of several problems that pressed on him with the steady, low-grade weight of something he'd learned to carry rather than put down. "Daddy? Grandma made pancakes for dinner," Lily told him. "Pancakes for dinner is a power move," Logan said. "What's a power move?" "It's when somebody does something brave." A pause. He could hear cartoons in the background at his mother's house, some show with exaggerated sound effects and voices pitched 3 octaves too high. "Are you being brave?" Lily asked. Logan looked through the windshield at the compound's metal siding. "Working on it, Bug," he said. "Okay." He went back inside after lunch and tried, successfully for most of the afternoon, not to think about the burned Porsche. He staged 4 vehicles for the following week's preview event, helped Darius polish a vintage Mercedes Roadster until it looked like liquid silver, and listened to Gerald Potts explain the staging protocol twice without any apparent awareness that he'd already explained it. At 4:30, Hargrove led a walkthrough of the storage floor with 2 members of his appraisal team and a man Logan didn't recognize. Older, heavyset, wearing a suit that was expensive but slightly wrong in a way Logan couldn't immediately name, like a costume rather than a wardrobe. The man had a lanyard with a guest badge and carried himself with the specific ease of someone who'd already been told how things were going to go. They paused at the burned Porsche for approximately 90 seconds. "Probable late 70s body," said one of Hargrove's team, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard. "Fire damage is extensive throughout. Chassis integrity is questionable without a structural assessment, but given the market position of the piece, a full structural assessment wouldn't be cost-effective." "It won't draw serious money," Hargrove said. He said it the way you'd note that a parking meter had expired. Factual. Forgettable. "Curiosity lot," said the other appraiser. "Curiosity lot," Hargrove agreed. 2,000 reserve, maybe 2,500. Someone with a project fantasy picks it up. We move on. The man in the guest badge looked at the car for a moment longer than the others. Then he nodded slowly and said nothing. They moved on. Logan was 8 feet away, crouching beside a vehicle he was checking for fluid leaks, and heard all of it. He didn't react. He went back to the fluid check. But the nagging thing that had started when the flatbed pulled in pressed a little harder. A late 70s body. He wasn't sure that was right. He knew Porsches. Not in the way the appraisers knew them. Not on paper. Not through auction records and provenance research and market comparables. He knew them the way you know something you've taken apart with your hands. His first real restoration job, 11 years ago, had been a 1972 911S that a retired schoolteacher in Parma had bought at an estate sale and then realized she had no idea what to do with. She'd found Logan through a neighbor, paid him in installments, and the 2 of them had spent 8 months putting that car back together in her garage, while she asked questions and he answered them, and they drank terrible instant coffee, and the work got done. He'd done 6 Porsche restorations since then, ranging from manageable to genuinely difficult. He understood the platform the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not just the systems, but the decisions behind them, the engineering logic, the quirks that varied by year and production run. The burned wreck in the corner didn't look like a late 70s car to him. It was hard to be certain. Fire damage at that level stripped away the obvious visual cues: trim, glass, badging, paint codes. But there were things fire couldn't entirely erase: body geometry, panel proportions, the relationship between the wheel arches and the door sills, the roofline angle. These things were structural, bone deep, and they didn't lie. What Logan had seen, in the 30 seconds he'd spent looking at that car from 8 feet away, suggested something older. Early 70s at the most recent, possibly late 60s, which was a meaningful difference in the collector market, worth potentially tens of thousands of dollars in provenance value alone, before you even started asking questions about what specific variant it might be. He thought about it through the afternoon. He thought about it on the drive back to his apartment. He thought about it while he heated soup on the stove and watched the evening news without retaining any of it. He told himself it wasn't his job. He told himself he'd probably misread it. He was a temp laborer in a navy polo shirt. Hargrove had been appraising vehicles for 30 years. The wire-rimmed glasses kid had probably cataloged more Porsches in a year than Logan had touched in his career. He ate his soup. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for 40 minutes thinking about the burned Porsche. On Thursday morning, he arrived 20 minutes early, which gave him time he hadn't planned on, and an empty storage floor that wouldn't fill with people for another half hour. He walked to the far corner. He pulled out his phone's flashlight and looked at the burned Porsche the way he would have looked at any vehicle he'd been asked to assess honestly. He started at the front. The hood collapse was severe, but he could see the original contour beneath the warped metal, the gentle slope, the way it met the fenders. He checked the front apron geometry, what remained of it. He moved to the driver's side and examined the A-pillar, then the roofline angle. He crouched and looked at the sill plate, at the relationship between the floor pan and the body. He moved to the rear and looked at the engine compartment. The lid was gone, the bay itself a cavity of soot and melted rubber, and studied what he could see of the rear suspension mounts. 12 minutes, methodical, nobody watching. When he straightened up, he was fairly certain of two things. First, this was not a late 70s car. The geometry was wrong for that era. This was earlier. His best rid put it at somewhere between 1967 and 1972, based on body proportions and structural details that were difficult to fake or destroy with fire. Second, and more troubling, the chassis had been modified. Not recently, and not clumsily. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. There were weld seams in places that didn't belong. Subtle, professionally executed, clearly intended to conceal rather than repair. The modifications were structural and deliberate. People didn't modify chassis to conceal damage. They modified chassis to conceal identity. Logan stood there in the quiet storage floor with his phone light off and his hands in his pockets and thought, someone went to serious trouble to make this car look like something it isn't. He heard Gerald Pott's voice somewhere near the entrance, which meant people were arriving. Logan walked back to the staging area and spent the morning doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He found Gerald Potts at 11:15 during a break in the staging work. "Hey, the burned Porsche in the far corner," Logan said. "The one that came in Wednesday." "What about it?" Gerald was looking at a clipboard. "I took a look at it this morning. The body geometry doesn't match a late 70s build. I think the appraisal team might want to—" "The appraisal team did their walkthrough yesterday," Gerald said. "Right, but I think—" "Logan." Gerald looked up from the clipboard with the particular patience of someone who was not going to have this conversation. "You're here to prep vehicles for staging. The appraisal team handles appraisals. That's how this works." "I'm not trying to do their job," Logan said. "I'm just saying that if they looked at—" "Hargrove's been doing this since before you were driving," Gerald said. Not unkindly, just finally. "If there was something to find, they found it." Logan nodded, walked away. He went back to the staging area and thought about what he'd seen and what Gerald had just said, and he understood that Gerald wasn't being malicious. Gerald was a man with a clipboard and a process and the structural inability to consider that the process might be wrong. Logan understood that. He'd worked for a lot of Geralds. The preview event was scheduled for Saturday, which meant the weekend was for setup, And by Friday afternoon, the storage floor was transformed into something that resembled an upscale showroom. Vehicles positioned under lighting rigs, velvet roping cordoning the high-value lots, placard stands with lot numbers and brief descriptions. The burned Porsche sat in its corner under a single overhead fluorescent, its low-value tag replaced with a proper auction placard. Lot 47, 1970s-era Porsche 911, extensive fire damage. As-is condition, reserve, $2,200. Logan read the placard while pretending to adjust a lighting cable nearby. 1970-something. They hadn't even committed to a decade. He thought about the weld seams, about the deliberate modification of the chassis, about the fact that someone, at some point, had wanted this car to be unrecognizable. The question that was starting to keep him up at night was, why? Victoria Sterling arrived on Friday afternoon. Logan knew it was her before anyone said her name, because the floor changed when she walked in. Not dramatically, not like people scrambling to attention, but in the way air changes before weather. People straightened slightly. Conversations concluded. Gerald Potts walked a little faster. She was shorter than Logan had expected from the magazine photos, which always shot her from angles that suggested height. In person, she was maybe 5'4", wearing dark slacks and a gray blazer over a white shirt, hair pulled back, walking with the particular efficiency of someone whose time was genuinely limited and who had made peace with that fact. She had a tablet under one arm and a coffee cup in the other, and she was talking to a man on her left, mid-40s, expensive haircut, with the focused attention of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting to speak. The man was one of her senior executives. Logan had heard people refer to him as Marcus. Full name, he'd later learn, was Marcus Reel, Vice President of Acquisitions, which was a title that covered a range of responsibilities Logan would come to understand more precisely in the weeks that followed. Victoria did a walkthrough of the floor with Marcus and two other executives behind her, pausing at each major lot, asking questions that the responses to seemed to satisfy her. She had the ease of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at in a room full of things most people would need a guide to navigate. She paused at lot 47. Logan was 15 feet away, adjusting a lighting rig, and watched without looking like he was watching. "This is the fire damage piece," Marcus said. He had a way of speaking that sounded simultaneously informative and slightly dismissive of the thing being described, as though his role was to help Victoria understand that certain things were beneath her attention. Victoria looked at the burned Porsche with the same expression she'd given the previous 3 lots. Evaluative, neutral, economical. Hargrove's team ran this? Full assessment Wednesday. The damage profile is too extensive for meaningful restoration. We're positioning it as a curiosity lot, attract the project car crowd. 2.2 reserve? We could probably do 2.5. These sometimes get a little action from people who don't know what they're getting into. A slight smile. Not a kind one. Victoria nodded. She looked at the car for one more moment, and then she looked up, and her eyes moved across the floor in the way that executives' eyes move, sweeping for the next thing, and Logan happened to be in her line of sight. She looked at him. Not with particular interest, just the reflexive visual inventory of someone moving through a space. Logan nodded, the way an employee nods at a boss, acknowledging, neutral. Victoria's eyes moved on. She moved to the next lot. Logan looked back at the burned Porsche and thought, $2,200. He called his mother that evening. Carol Mercer had the phone manner of someone who had spent decades absorbing other people's problems without complaint, which made her both the best person to call and the person he was most careful not to burden. They talked about Lily first, a drawing Lily had made at school that Carol described in enough detail that Logan could picture it exactly. A crayon rendering of a house with a very large sun and a small figure with yellow hair that Lily had labeled Datey in block letters that were almost certainly backward Ds. "She asked when you're getting the bigger apartment," Carol said. "I'm working on it," Logan said. "I know you are." She said it without judgment, which was somehow harder to hear than judgment would have been. "She's fine here, Logan. She's happy. You know that." "Yeah. But she wants to be with you." "I know, Mom." A pause. "You sound like something's bothering you," Carol said. He told her about the burned Porsche. Not all of it, just the outline. The car that looked wrong, the appraisers who'd dismissed it, the $2,000 reserve. His mother listened the way she always listened, which was completely. "And you think it's worth more?" she said. "I think nobody's looked at it properly," Logan said, "which is different." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," he said. "Probably nothing. It's not my car. It's not my company. I'm there to move things and not touch anything I'm not supposed to touch." "But," he looked at the wall of his apartment. "But something's wrong with it," he said. "Something deliberate. Somebody went to real trouble to make that car into something it isn't, and now it's going to sell for grocery money." Carol was quiet for a moment. "You've always hated that," she said. "When things are what they're pretending not to be." Logan didn't answer, because she was right, and answering would have been redundant. Saturday was preview day, which meant the compound was open to registered bidders and their representatives, collectors, dealers, specialists, a scattering of enthusiasts whose paddle numbers would be more aspirational than operational. The floor filled up by mid-morning, and Logan spent the day doing exactly what Gerald Potts assigned him, which kept him close enough to the floor that he could observe without making a point of it. He watched the preview visitors move through the lots. Most of them paused at lot 47 with the same expression, the specific mix of curiosity and dismissal that fire-damaged vehicles reliably produced. A few took photographs. One heavy-set man in a plaid shirt crouched and looked at the undercarriage, then stood up and moved on without apparent interest. Nobody lingered. Nobody looked at it the way Logan looked at it. He spent his break in the far corner, closer to the burned car than was strictly necessary for a man eating a granola bar, and looked at the weld seams he'd noticed on Thursday morning. He'd been thinking about them for 2 days. In that time, he'd run through the catalog of reasons someone modifies a chassis: structural repair, custom fabrication, accident rebuilding, and kept arriving at the same conclusion. None of those explanations accounted for the care and deliberateness of what he was looking at. Repair welds are utilitarian. These were careful, intentional, hidden. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be Gerald Potts sending a group text about the Saturday afternoon schedule. He pocketed the phone. And then, because he was already crouching and the light was hitting the right angle and he had nothing to lose by looking, he examined the rear section of the floor pan more carefully than he had before. He traced the line of one of the weld seams with his eye, following where it led, and noticed something he hadn't noticed Thursday morning. There was a shadow beneath the welded metal that didn't belong. Something was underneath it. Something that had been welded over, not welded shut. A panel. Or a plate. Something flat and attached, covered deliberately by a layer of added metal. Logan sat back on his heels. His heart was doing something it hadn't done in a while. The specific quickening of a man who has just understood that what he thought was a suspicion is actually a certainty. Somebody had put something under there. Or put metal over something that was already there. Something they didn't want found. He stood up, looked around. The floor was busy. Preview visitors, staff, Hargrove's team working the room with their iPads. He walked back to the staging area with careful, unhurried steps. The way you walk when you're trying not to look like you've just learned something important. He spent Saturday evening at the library. He'd thought about doing the research on his phone, but the library had better databases, and he had a library card he'd kept current because Lily liked the picture book section. He sat at a terminal for 3 hours and looked at everything he could find about Porsche prototype production. The factory records that were publicly accessible, the auction literature, the provenance documentation from major sales, the specialist publications. The collector car world had its own archaeology. Vehicles didn't just exist, they had histories, paper trails, original factory records that authenticated them. The most significant Porsches, the experimental models, the factory racers, the one-of-a-kind development vehicles, had documentation that serious collectors and historians had spent decades assembling, and some of them had gaps in their histories. Periods of years, sometimes decades, where the car simply disappeared from the record, sold informally, hidden, destroyed, or changed hands in ways that didn't generate paperwork. In the collector world, these cars were called lost, not because their existence was in doubt, but because their current location was unknown. Logan found what he was looking for in the third hour. A 1969 Porsche factory development vehicle, an experimental prototype built in very limited numbers as a testing platform for engineering concepts that the factory was evaluating for future production. Not a race car, though it was related to the racing program. An engineering car, the kind of vehicle that stayed inside the factory walls and existed in photographs and internal documents and the memories of the engineers who'd worked on it. Several of these vehicles had been documented and eventually sold or preserved. A few had been destroyed, and one, chassis number that Logan memorized, had been unaccounted for since 1978. He sat with that for a moment. 1978. When a car disappeared from the record in the collector world, it didn't mean it was gone. It meant someone had it and didn't want anyone to know they had it. Sometimes because the acquisition was irregular, sometimes because the car was being moved across borders, sometimes because someone had stripped it for parts and was embarrassed about it. And sometimes, rare, but it happened, because the car had been deliberately disguised, changed enough that it couldn't be identified at a glance, sold as something common, hidden in plain sight. He wrote the chassis number on a piece of paper. He didn't know if it matched what was under the weld on Lot 47. He couldn't know from a library terminal. But the dimensions he'd read, the factory specifications for the development vehicle, matched the body geometry he'd assessed with his hands and his eyes on Thursday morning with a precision that made his jaw tighten. He drove home in the dark with the paper on the passenger seat and tried to think about what a reasonable person would do next. On Monday morning, he went to Gerald Potts. "I need 5 minutes with the appraisal team," Logan said. Gerald looked at him with an expression that had already concluded this was going to be complicated. "About?" "The burned Porsche, Lot 47. I've done some research over the weekend, and I think there's something under the weld seams on the floor pan that the team might want to look at before the auction." Gerald's face settled into the particular arrangement of a man who is going to say no and would prefer not to have to explain why. "The appraisal is complete," Gerald said. "I understand that, but if I'm right, the car might be significantly misidentified." "Might be. I'd like 10 minutes to show Hargrove what I found." A long pause. Gerald looked at the clipboard, then at Logan, then at the middle distance. "I'll ask," he said, which meant no, but delivered gently. Logan spent the morning staging vehicles and waiting. At 11:30, Gerald found him. "Hargrove's team is fully committed to the lead-up work," Gerald said. "They've reviewed the lot. They're comfortable with the assessment." "Did you tell him what I said? About the weld seams?" Gerald's expression flickered, something that might have been discomfort or might have been pity. "He said fire-damaged vehicles commonly have repaired sections," Gerald said. "That it's standard." Logan looked at him. "These aren't repairs," Logan said quietly. "These are concealments." "Logan." "I know," Logan said. "Thank you for asking." He walked back to the staging area. He thought about Lily's drawing, the house with the big sun, the small figure with the backward D. He thought about the piece of paper in his pocket with the chassis number on it. He thought about the auction, which was 11 days away. He thought about a voice that nobody was listening to, and a car that nobody was looking at, and a secret that had been welded shut under layers of metal and fire damage, and the comfortable certainty of people who believed they already knew everything worth knowing. He picked up the staging checklist and went back to work. By the end of Monday, he had decided that he was going to look under the weld, not during business hours, not with permission, which wasn't coming, after hours, with his own tools on his own time. He'd have to be there when the compound was closed, which meant figuring out how to stay behind without it being noticed, which was a problem he hadn't fully solved yet. He stayed late under the pretense of completing a staging checklist that Gerald had asked him to finish, and when the compound emptied at 6:15 and the skeleton security crew settled into their booth at the entrance, Logan was in the storage floor near a staging station with a coffee and a plausible reason to be there. He waited until 7. Then he went to Lot 47. He had a small pry tool in his jacket pocket. Nothing dramatic, just a flat bar he'd brought from his own kit that morning. And a flashlight, and the piece of paper, and the particular focus of a man who has spent a week being told he's wrong about something he's increasingly certain he's right about. He crouched beside the rear section of the burned Porsche and examined the weld seam, Up close, with good light, it was even more deliberate than he'd thought. Someone had laid a plate of metal over the original floor pan surface and welded it down with care and consistency. The weld bead was old, oxidized, darkened, consistent with work done decades ago. This wasn't recent. He located the edge where the concealment plate met the original pan and worked the tip of the flat bar into the seam with gentle, patient pressure. The metal resisted. He adjusted the angle, tried again. On the fourth attempt, something shifted. Not broke. Shifted. The adhesion of decades of oxidization releasing at one edge, just enough to confirm that the plate was separate from the pan, that there was space between them, that something was there. He stopped, took his hands away, looked at the seam. Under that plate, something was attached to the original floor pan, something that had been here since before the fire, since before the car became what it looked like now, something that somebody had worked hard to hide. Logan sat back on his heels in the dark storage floor. His hands were steady, his head was clear. He thought about what came next, how to do this properly, how to document it, how to make the case to people who'd already decided not to listen. He thought about the auction 11 days away, and the $2,200 reserve, and the heavy-set man in the plaid shirt who'd crouched at the car during the preview and walked away without interest. He thought about the chassis number on the paper in his pocket. He took out his phone and photographed the weld seam from 3 angles. Then he photographed the shift point where he'd worked the flat bar. Then the overall positioning on the floor pan. Then he stood up, put his tools away, and walked out of the storage floor with his phone and his photographs and the particular quiet of a man who has just understood that he's the only person standing between a secret and a very expensive mistake. Outside, the October air was cold and still and smelled like diesel from the rail corridor. He sat in his truck for a while. Then he drove home through the dark Cleveland streets, past the houses with their porch lights on, past his mother's house on Denison Avenue where Lily was sleeping in the room that used to be his, and he thought about a promise he'd made to himself after Lily's mother left, that he was done letting things go when he knew better. He hadn't always been good at that promise. He was going to try again. He didn't sleep well that night. That wasn't unusual. Logan had a complicated relationship with sleep that had started around the time Lily's mother walked out and hadn't fully resolved itself in the 3 years since. But this was a different kind of sleeplessness, not the heavy, grinding kind that came from worry about money, or the apartment situation, or whether Lily was going to be okay in the long run. This was the tight, alert wakefulness of a man whose brain had found a problem it refused to release. He lay on his back in the dark and thought about chassis numbers. The vehicle he'd found in the library database, the 1969 factory development prototype, had been built in a period when Porsche's engineering division was pushing into territory that the production cars hadn't reached yet. The factory had constructed several development platforms during that era, vehicles that existed not as products, but as experiments. They weren't meant for sale. They were working tools built to test systems and stress test engineering concepts under real-world conditions. Most of them were destroyed when their usefulness ended. A few were preserved, and at least one had dropped out of the record in the late 70s under circumstances that the historical documentation described with the careful vagueness of institutional memory as transferred to private ownership, documentation incomplete. Transferred to private ownership, documentation incomplete. Logan knew what that meant. He'd dealt enough with estate sales and informal transactions and cars that had changed hands and handshake deals over the past decade to understand that documentation incomplete was the collector world's polite way of saying, someone took it and nobody asked too many questions. By 3 a.m, he'd given up on sleep and was sitting at his kitchen table with his laptop, a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and the photographs he'd taken in the storage floor. He looked at the photographs the way you look at something you're trying to make stop being what it is. The weld seam was clear in the images, unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at, invisible if you didn't. The shift point where the concealment plate had moved under pressure from the flat bar was visible as a hairline shadow at the plate's edge. Something was under there. He was certain of it. The question he kept returning to was not whether he was right. He'd moved past that. The question was what happened when a temp laborer at an auction company, a man hired to move cars and keep his mouth shut, walked into his supervisor's office with photographs on his phone and a chassis number on a piece of paper and said, "I think you're about to sell a multi-million-dollar prototype for the price of a used riding lawnmower." He knew how that conversation ended. He'd already had a version of it with Gerald, and Gerald was probably the most receptive person in the building. He drank the cold coffee and thought about it for a while. Then he opened the laptop and started looking for a different approach. His name was Arthur Gaines, and he was 71 years old and lived in a house in Shaker Heights that was so full of automotive literature and reference materials that his daughter had twice attempted interventions on the subject of hoarding, which Arthur had endured with the patience of a man who understood that he was right and simply needed to wait for everyone else to catch up. Logan found him through a restorers forum he'd been a member of for years, a corner of the internet populated by people who argued passionately about the correct gauge of wiring harness for a 1968 Alfa Romeo and considered this a reasonable use of their time. Arthur Gaines was a fixture on the forum, known for meticulous research and a particular expertise in German sports car provenance from the 1960s and 70s. He wasn't a working appraiser. He was something more useful, an independent historian who cared more about getting things right than about what getting things right cost him professionally. Logan sent him a message at 4 in the morning, which he recognized was not ideal timing, but which he also could not help. He described what he'd seen: the body geometry, the weld seams, the concealment plate. He included 2 of the photographs. He mentioned the chassis number he'd found in the public records. He did not mention where the car was or what auction company had it. He sent the message and went to bed and slept badly for 3 hours, and woke up to Lily calling his cell phone from his mother's house because she wanted to tell him about a dream she'd had involving a talking fish. "What did the fish say?" Logan asked, sitting on the edge of his bed with his eyes half open. "It said it was tired of swimming," Lily said. "It wanted to walk around." "Can't really blame it," Logan said. "Daddy, do fish get tired?" "Probably," Logan said. "Everything gets tired." A pause. He could hear his mother's kitchen sounds in the background. The coffee maker, a cabinet closing. "Are you tired?" Lily asked. "A little bit, Bug." "You should sleep more." "You're absolutely right," he said. "I know," she said, with the serene certainty of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to doubt herself, and Logan felt the specific ache of loving someone so completely that it occasionally felt like a structural problem. "Check," Arthur Gaines replied at 9:47 that morning, which suggested he either kept unusual hours or checked his messages with the dedication of a man who had genuinely nothing more pressing to do. The reply was long. Logan read it standing in the Sterling compound parking lot during his morning break, hunched over his phone with his coffee going cold in his other hand. Arthur had looked at the photographs. He'd cross-referenced the body geometry observations against his personal records, which were, apparently, considerably more extensive than what was available in any public database. He was careful with his language. Preliminary, further examination required. I would not stake my reputation on a photograph. But beneath the careful language was a thread of unmistakable excitement, the kind that a 71-year-old man who has spent decades waiting for a particular thing cannot entirely suppress when that thing might have finally appeared. The chassis number Logan had found in the public records, Arthur wrote, corresponded to a development vehicle that Arthur himself had been tracking, informally, as a research interest, for approximately 15 years. The last confirmed documentation placed it in a private collection in western Pennsylvania in 1978. After that, nothing. It had been an open question in a very small community of people who cared about such things. The body proportions Logan had described were consistent with the vehicle in question. The weld modifications, concealment of a factory identification plate, Arthur wrote, was exactly the kind of modification someone would make to a car they were moving through channels where proper documentation would create inconvenient questions. He'd seen it before, though rarely on vehicles of this significance. At the bottom of the reply, Arthur wrote, "If you can get me access to the vehicle, I will drive to wherever it is tomorrow." Logan read that last line twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and stood in the parking lot and exhaled slowly and thought, okay. Getting Arthur Gaines access to the vehicle was not a simple proposition. He thought about the direct approach first, going back to Gerald, this time with Arthur's name and credentials and the specific detail about the concealment plate, and discarded it. Gerald had already delivered the message to Hargrove and received a polite dismissal in return. A second approach, from the same source, citing the same concern with slightly more specificity, was not going to produce a different result. Hargrove's team had made their assessment. The institutional momentum of that assessment was now moving in one direction, and Logan understood from experience that institutional momentum was not stopped by a mechanic with photographs on his phone. He needed to go around Gerald. He thought about that for most of Tuesday morning, and by lunch he'd identified the only realistic path. He needed to speak to someone senior enough that they could override the appraisal process, and he needed to do it with enough specificity that they couldn't dismiss it without at least checking, which meant he needed to speak to Victoria Sterling. He turned that idea over in his head for a while, the way you turn over something you know is going to be uncomfortable. He'd seen her on the floor Friday afternoon, efficient, precise, clearly competent. She'd looked at the burned Porsche for 45 seconds and accepted Marcus's characterization of it without question. But that didn't mean she was wrong. She was running a large business. She trusted her team to manage technical assessments. That was reasonable. What was also true, she was the only person in the building with the authority and the standing to stop the auction process if the evidence warranted it. He found Priya, Hargrove's assistant, at the break room coffee station and asked her, with the casualness of someone asking about the weather, how requests for meetings with Victoria Sterling typically worked. Priya looked at him the way people look at someone who has said something innocent that turns out to be genuinely funny. "You want a meeting with Victoria?" "If that's possible," Logan said. Are you from a major buyers group or something?" "No, I'm on the floor team." Priya stared at him. "Floor staff don't typically, she started. "I have information about one of the auction lots," Logan said. "Specific, documented information that I think she'd want to know before the auction." Priya looked at him with the expression of someone who is trying to decide whether the person they're talking to is earnest or unhinged. "I can pass a message to her assistant," she said finally, "but I'm not promising anything." "That's all I'm asking," Logan said. "Better decides." He did not hear back on Tuesday. He did not hear back on Wednesday morning. In the meantime, he kept working. He staged vehicles. He helped Darius reassemble a disassembled storage rack. He answered Gerald's questions with the cooperation of a man who had no outstanding concerns. He kept his face neutral and his movements deliberate and his thoughts to himself. Wednesday afternoon, Arthur Gaines drove from Shaker Heights to the Sterling Compound's parking lot and sat in his car for 20 minutes before Logan could get outside on a break. Arthur was exactly what his forum post suggested. A compact, precise man with white hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the slightly distracted energy of someone whose primary attention was always on something in the near past or near future rather than the present moment. He shook Logan's hand with a firm, brief grip. "I looked at the public records again last night," Arthur said, before Logan had entirely finished the handshake. The factory documentation for the development series from that period lists 9 vehicles. 6 are accounted for in institutional or documented private collections. 1 was destroyed in a factory fire in 1971. Well, there are photographs. 1 was dismantled for parts in the early 80s, also documented. That leaves 1. He paused. 1 that nobody has seen since 1978. "What are we talking about? If it's that car," Logan said. Arthur looked at him steadily. "At auction, with proper provenance documentation, you're talking about a number that starts with 7 and has 6 more digits behind it." Logan was quiet for a moment. $7 million, he said. "Minimum," Arthur said. "With the right room and the right climate, possibly more." The parking lot was very ordinary around them. A delivery truck idling near the loading dock, the sound of the rail corridor in the distance. "And they're going to sell it for $2,200, Logan said. Arthur's mouth pressed into a thin line that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. "Not if we can help it," he said. Getting Arthur into the storage floor that evening required a sequence of small logistical decisions that Logan worked through with the focus of a man solving an engineering problem. He was still on the schedule for late staging work. Gerald had him listed through 7 o'clock. He told Arthur to come in at 6:30, introduced him to the security crew at the entrance as a consultant he was assisting, and walked him through the employee side entrance with the practiced ease of someone who had been working there for 2 weeks and whose face was recognized if not his name. Nobody stopped them. That was luck, partly, and partly the basic human tendency to not interrogate someone who moves with confidence. Arthur went straight to Lot 47 like a man walking towards something he'd been looking for 15 years, which was exactly what he was. He pulled on examination gloves. He'd brought them in his jacket pocket, because Arthur Gaines was the kind of man who carried examination gloves in his jacket pocket, and got down on his knees on the storage floor in his khaki trousers and started looking. Logan stood back and watched and let him work. Arthur was quiet for a long time. He examined the body geometry with a small measuring tool he'd also brought in his pocket. He looked at the weld seams with a loop. He traced the same path Logan had traced, but with the additional precision of someone who had the factory specifications memorized, rather than reconstructed from library research. After 20 minutes, Arthur sat back and looked at Logan. "You're right about the concealment plate," he said. "That's exactly what that is, and the geometry is consistent." He paused. "If the identification plate is intact under the weld, and given the quality of the concealment work, whoever did this may have been trying to preserve it rather than destroy it, then we can confirm identity definitively." "Can you get access to factory records that would verify the chassis number?" Logan asked. "I have contacts," Arthur said. "People who have worked with the factory archive. It would take a few days, but yes." Logan nodded. "We need to get someone in this company to listen before the auction," Logan said. Arthur looked at the burned Porsche for a moment, the ruined hulk under the fluorescent light, the low-value placard, the orange auction tag on what remained of the door. "In my experience," Arthur said, "the people who are wrong about things like this fall into 2 categories. The first category is people who haven't seen the evidence yet. The second category is people who have reasons not to want to see the evidence." He looked at Logan. "Which category do you think you're dealing with?" Logan thought about Hargrove and his walkthrough, about Marcus and the 45 seconds and the slight smile, about the man in the expensive suit with the guest badge who had looked at the car a few seconds longer than anyone else. "I'm not sure yet," Logan said. Arthur stood up, brushing dust from his trousers, and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The message came the next morning, Thursday, passed through Priya with the neutral efficiency of an office assistant who had decided not to have opinions about the content she was delivering. Victoria Sterling had 20 minutes available Friday at 8 a.m. She noted that it was unusual to accommodate this type of request from floor staff, and she expected the matter to be specific and substantive. Logan read the message 3 times. 20 minutes. That was what he had. He spent Thursday evening organizing everything he had: the photographs, Arthur's written preliminary assessment, the library research with the chassis number and the historical documentation, the specific technical observations about the weld seams and the concealment plate. He put it in order. He thought about how to explain it to someone who was intelligent and skeptical and whose time was genuinely limited and who had already, in some sense, made up her mind. He'd been in rooms before where being right wasn't enough, where the argument had to be not just correct, but delivered in a way that the person across the table could accept without feeling like they were conceding something. It was a particular skill, different from knowing things, and Logan was aware that it was not his strongest. He practiced the conversation in his head while he drove. He thought about the 20 minutes. He thought about what mattered and what didn't. Marcus Reel was in Victoria's office when Logan arrived. That hadn't been the expectation. He'd been told 20 minutes with Victoria, singular, which was already a limited runway. The addition of Marcus, who was sitting in one of the chairs across the desk, with his jacket buttoned and his expression carrying the polite impatience of a man who had agreed to attend a meeting he considered beneath the occasion, made the calculus considerably more complicated. Victoria was at her desk, standing rather than sitting, which Logan read as a signal about how she felt about the 20 minutes. She was dressed more formally than the Friday he'd seen her on the floor. A dark blazer, her hair down rather than pulled back. She looked at Logan when he came in with the direct, undecorated assessment of someone who has learned to take the measure of a person quickly and does not have time for the social preamble that most meetings begin with. Logan Mercer, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. Priya said you have specific information about one of the auction lots. Sit down. He sat. Marcus looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite hostile and wasn't quite anything else. The look of a man who is present at a meeting he doesn't consider a meeting. Logan put his phone on the desk and set the printed pages beside it, Arthur's preliminary assessment and the historical documentation. Lot 47, Logan said. The burned Porsche. Marcus made a small sound, not quite a scoff, but close enough. We have a full appraisal on that lot, Marcus said, addressing the remark to Victoria rather than Logan. Hargrove's team completed it on Wednesday of last week. I know, Logan said. He kept his eyes on Victoria. I'm not questioning the team's process. I'm telling you that the assessment is wrong. A brief silence. Victoria looked at him. Wrong how? She said. The car has been misidentified, Logan said. The fire damage made a direct visual assessment difficult, but the body geometry doesn't match a late 70s build. It's older, probably 1969, and there are modifications to the chassis, deliberate, professionally executed modifications that were designed to conceal the vehicle's identity. He walked her through it. He kept it tight. He'd practiced this. He knew which details mattered and which were noise. The geometry observations, the weld seams, the concealment plate and what it meant that someone had built it, the library research and the chassis number. Arthur Gaines and his 15 years of tracking the vehicle in question, his preliminary assessment, his specific observation that the concealment work was consistent with preservation rather than destruction of the identification plate underneath. He talked for 7 minutes without interruption. When he finished, Marcus leaned forward slightly. This is a mechanic's read of a fire-damaged vehicle, Marcus said. With respect, Hargrove has 30 years of experience. This kind of thing. Hargrove spent 90 seconds with the car, Logan said. He said it evenly, without heat, because heat was not what the room needed. I spent 2 weeks looking at it. You're a temp laborer, Marcus said. That's true, Logan said. And I've done 6 Porsche restorations, which is more time than Hargrove spent under that chassis. He looked at Victoria, who had not spoken since asking how the assessment was wrong. She was looking at the photographs on his phone. She'd been looking at them since he'd laid the phone on the desk. She hadn't picked it up, but she was looking at it with an attention that was different from the attention she'd given the car on the preview floor. This expert you mentioned, she said, Arthur Gaines. He's been researching this specific vehicle for 15 years, Logan said. He drove from Shaker Heights yesterday to look at the car. He's willing to submit a formal written assessment. He's an independent historian, Marcus said. He's not a credentialed appraiser. No, Logan agreed, but he's right. Marcus started to say something and Victoria raised one hand, not dramatically, just a small gesture, palm out, and Marcus stopped. She looked at Logan for a moment. Not the quick assessment she'd given him when he walked in, something more considered. If the identification plate is intact under the weld, she said, what does the plate tell us? Factory chassis number, Logan said. Stamped at the time of manufacture. If it matches the prototype documentation, the vehicle's identity is confirmed. That's the end of the question. And if it doesn't match? Then I'm wrong, Logan said. And you've lost nothing but 20 minutes. Another silence. Victoria looked at the photographs again. Then she looked at Marcus. Something moved across Marcus's face. Something that Logan caught and filed away without being entirely sure what it was. A tightening around the eyes. Something controlled. The auction is in 8 days, Marcus said. Reopening a completed appraisal at this stage? If the lot is misidentified, reopening the appraisal is exactly what we do, Victoria said. Her voice was level, and there was something in it that suggested the subject was closer to settled than Marcus seemed to realize. She looked at Logan. I'll have Hargrove review your materials, she said. Logan held the moment. With respect, he said. Hargrove already dismissed this without looking at it. I'd ask that an independent structural assessment be done on the floor pan, someone who can look at the weld and evaluate what's underneath without a prior conclusion to protect. The room was quiet. Marcus looked at him steadily. Victoria said, I'll think about it. Which was not yes, but it was not the no that Logan had half expected. and he'd learned enough about how rooms like this worked to understand the difference. He picked up his phone. He left the printed pages on the desk. "Thank you for the time," he said. He walked out of the office and down the corridor and back to the storage floor where Gerald Potts had a clipboard and a list of things that needed to be done before noon. He picked up the clipboard and started working through the list. He didn't know what Victoria was going to decide. He didn't know what Marcus would say to her after he left, or what pressure Hargrove would apply when the meeting became known to him, which it would. He didn't know whether 20 minutes and a phone full of photographs and a printed assessment from a retired historian in Shaker Heights were enough to stop a process that had 8 days of momentum behind it. What he knew was that he'd said what he needed to say to the person who needed to hear it. The rest was not in his hands. He worked through the morning with the focused, steady attention of a man who is trying very hard not to think about the thing he is thinking about. At lunch, he called his mother and asked about Lily, and Carol told him Lily had announced at breakfast that she intended to become an astronaut who also made pancakes, which she considered an underrepresented career combination. "She's not wrong," Logan said. "She's never wrong," Carol said. "She gets that from you." "I'm wrong plenty," Logan said. "About the things that matter," Carol said. "You're not." He sat in his truck and ate his sandwich and watched the entrance of the Sterling compound and thought about a burned car in a corner of the storage floor and the concealment plate over the identification stamp and 8 days until the auction and a conversation in an executive office that had ended with 3 words that meant everything and nothing at once. He finished the sandwich. He went back inside. He told himself that being right was not enough, and that he knew that, and that he'd done what he could, and he almost believed it. Victoria did not call him back that day. She did not call him back Saturday either, which was the preview day. And Logan spent 8 hours on the floor helping manage the flow of registered bidders while the burned Porsche sat in its corner under its fluorescent light and its low-value placard and its $2,200 reserve, and he kept his face neutral and his mouth shut and did his job. Sunday, he was not scheduled, which gave him too much time to think in an apartment that was too quiet. He drove to his mother's house and spent the afternoon with Lily, who was in a phase of intense interest in anything with wheels, and had asked Carol to save every magazine with a car on the cover, which meant there was now a stack of publications on the coffee table that included 3 issues of a trucking trade journal, a boating magazine that Lily had included because the boat on the cover had wheels on its trailer, and one of Logan's own collector car publications that he'd left there weeks ago and which Lily had appointed herself custodian of. They sat on the living room floor together, Lily turning pages and asking questions with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone who has decided that all information is equally urgent. "What's that one?" "That's a Ferrari." "Is it fast?" "Very." "Faster than your truck?" "Considerably." "Why do you like old cars better than new cars?" Logan thought about it. Lily was 6, but she had the gift of asking questions that deserved real answers. "Because old cars have more story in them," he said. "They've been places. Things happen to them. You can look at an old car and figure out what kind of life it had." Lily considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Like people?" she said. "Pretty much exactly like people," Logan said. She went back to the magazine. Logan looked at the wall and thought about a burned Porsche in a corner of a storage floor and a phone that hadn't rung. Monday arrived and delivered Gerald Potts with a clipboard and a tightness around his mouth that Logan recognized as a man who had been told something he didn't enjoy knowing. "Hargrove wants to talk to you," Gerald said. "Okay," Logan said. His office, 10 o'clock. "Okay," Logan said again. Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who wants to offer a warning but isn't sure he's authorized to. "Logan," he said, then stopped. "I know," Logan said. "Thanks." Hargrove's office was a glass-walled room off the main appraisal suite, neat in the way that certain men's offices are neat. Not because they are tidy by nature, but because tidiness signals control. Diplomas and industry certifications on the wall. A desk with nothing on it except a leather pad, a coffee cup, and a manila folder. Hargrove himself was standing when Logan came in, which Logan noted as a choice. "Close the door," Hargrove said. Logan closed it. "Sit down." Logan sat. Hargrove remained standing, which Logan also noted. I understand you met with Victoria Friday morning, Hargrove said. I did, Logan said. And you presented some concerns about Lot 47. I did. Hargrove picked up the manila folder from the desk. Inside it, Logan could see were the printed pages he'd left in Victoria's office, Arthur's assessment, the historical documentation. I've reviewed this, Hargrove said. The observations from this... He glanced at the top page. Arthur Gaines. I'm aware of Gaines. He's a hobbyist with opinions. He's not a credentialed appraiser. He's a historian, Logan said, with 15 years of specific research on this vehicle. On a vehicle he believes this might be, Hargrove said, based on photographs taken by a mechanic in low light. He set the folder down and looked at Logan directly. My team assessed Lot 47 thoroughly. For 90 seconds, Logan said. Hargrove's jaw moved slightly. Excuse me? I was in the storage floor when you did the walkthrough. You spent approximately 90 seconds at the lot. Your team's notes on the assessment are... Logan had read them through Priya. 4 lines. Fire damage extensive throughout. Chassis integrity questionable. Market position low. No further assessment cost effective. He paused. That's not a thorough assessment. That's a first impression. The room was very quiet. Hargrove looked at him with the particular look of a man who has spent 30 years being the authority in every room he enters and has encountered very few people willing to say the thing Logan had just said directly to his face. You're a temp laborer, Hargrove said, flatly. You are here to move vehicles and assist with staging. The appraisal function is not your responsibility and never was. I know that, Logan said. I'm not trying to do your job. I'm trying to stop a significant mistake. There is no mistake. There's a concealment plate on the floor pan, Logan said, welded over what I believe is a factory identification stamp. If I'm wrong, a 30-second inspection proves it. If I'm right, you're not right, Hargrove said. How do you know? Logan said. You haven't looked. Another silence. Longer this time. Hargrove sat down. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down without drinking from it, which Logan read as a man buying a second to think. I'm going to be direct with you, Hargrove said. Your contract here runs through the auction. After that, it's done. Whether that relationship continues in any form depends on how the next week goes. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you're doing here and what it costs you. Logan looked at him. Is that advice or a warning? Logan said. Hargrove held his gaze for a moment. Whichever is more useful, he said. Logan nodded. He stood up. He went back to the storage floor and told himself that his hands were not shaking, which was mostly true. Arthur Gaines called him that afternoon. He had a contact at a European automotive archive, someone who'd spent decades compiling factory records from that era, the kind of institutional memory that existed in 3 or 4 people in the world and nowhere else. Arthur had sent photographs in his preliminary assessment. The contact had responded within 18 hours, which Arthur said was unusually fast and suggested the photographs had caused some excitement on the other end. The chassis dimensions you recorded, Arthur said. Logan was in his truck in the parking lot, the phone pressed to his ear, watching the compound's entrance. The ones from your initial inspection. Yeah. They're consistent with the factory specification for the development series to within 4 millimeters. Logan was quiet. 4 millimeters, he repeated, which is within normal manufacturing tolerance, Arthur said. My contact wants to know where the car is. I know where the car is, Logan said. I need to know what happens if we can access the identification plate. If the stamp is intact and the number matches the factory record, Arthur said, that's confirmation. That's not we believe or we assess. That's a documented match to factory records held by an institution that has been maintaining them for 60 years. That's authentication. And the car can't be sold without that authentication being known, Logan said. Not legitimately. No legitimate auction house in the world would knowingly sell a vehicle of that provenance at a misidentified lot value, Arthur said. The liability alone would... I know, Logan said. I know. He sat in the truck after the call and looked at the compound building and thought about Hargrove's office and the warning that had been dressed as advice and the auction that was now 6 days away. He had the evidence. He had a credentialed historian willing to stake his professional reputation on the preliminary assessment. He had photographic documentation of the concealment work. He had factory record correlation from an international archive. And he had been told, in language just clear enough to be understood, to let it go. He thought about Lily on the living room floor with the magazines, about old cars having stories, about being able to look at something that had been somewhere and figure out what kind of life it had lived. He started the truck and drove back inside. He tried Victoria one more time, on Tuesday. He sent a message through Priya, not requesting a meeting, just 3 sentences. The archive contact has correlated the chassis dimensions to factory records. The identification plate under the weld can confirm authentication. I'm asking for an independent structural assessment before the auction. The reply came back 2 hours later through Priya, again, 4 words. The matter is reviewed. Which was not yes and not no, and was, Logan was beginning to understand, the answer he was going to keep getting until time ran out. He thought about why. He'd been turning that over since the meeting with Hargrove, since the warning that was advice, since Marcus's face in Victoria's office, the controlled tightening around the eyes when Logan described what was under the weld. He'd been treating the resistance as institutional inertia, the natural defensiveness of an organization protecting a completed process. But institutional inertia didn't produce personal warnings. Inertia was passive. What Hargrove had done in his office was not passive. Someone in this building had a reason to want Lot 47 to sell for $2,200. He sat with that thought for a long time, because it changed the shape of everything. If the misidentification was accidental, a genuine failure of the assessment process, then the problem was correctable. You present the evidence to the right person, the auction is paused, an independent expert examines the vehicle, the truth comes out, the lot is revalued, everything is uncomfortable but ultimately resolved. But if the misidentification was deliberate, if someone inside the company had ensured that Lot 47 was assessed as worthless, knowing what it actually was, planning to acquire it through a third party at the fraudulent reserve price, and then authenticate it after the fact, then presenting evidence to people inside the company was not going to work, because the people inside the company either already knew or were being managed by someone who did. He thought about the man in the expensive suit with the guest badge, the one who'd looked at the burned Porsche a few seconds longer than everyone else on the Friday walkthrough, the one whose badge Logan hadn't been able to read from 8 feet away. He called Arthur that evening. If someone wanted to acquire a misidentified vehicle fraudulently, Logan said, through a legitimate auction at a fraudulent reserve, how would they structure it? Arthur was quiet for a moment. You think that's what's happening? I think it might be, Logan said. Walk me through how it would work. Arthur walked him through it. It wasn't complicated in structure. An insider, someone with influence over the appraisal process, ensures the vehicle is assessed at a negligible value. A connected buyer acquires it at auction for the reserve price or marginally above. The vehicle is then transferred to a private collection or a different auction context where the true identity is authenticated after the fact. The profit on the spread between fraudulent acquisition price and authenticated market value would be in the millions. The insider would need to be senior enough to influence the appraisal team, Arthur said, and they'd need a buyer who could move the car out of the country quickly after acquisition before anyone looked too hard. What if someone stopped the sale? Logan said. On the auction floor. If the sale was physically interrupted and the plate was exposed in front of witnesses, a long pause. That's a very large gamble, Arthur said. I know, Logan said. If you're right, you stop a multi-million-dollar fraud. If you're wrong, you've disrupted a legitimate auction at a major company as a temp laborer with no standing. I know that too, Logan said. Logan. Yeah. Make sure you're right, Arthur said. But the auction was Saturday. Logan spent Wednesday night, Thursday, and most of Friday in the storage floor after hours, working with the patience and precision that 11 years of restoration had given him. He wasn't doing anything to the car. He wasn't touching the weld, wasn't attempting to expose the plate. He was documenting, photographing every angle of the chassis modifications, measuring and recording, building the physical record of what was there with the same methodical care he'd give any vehicle he was preparing for a condition report. On Friday afternoon, Arthur drove back from Shaker Heights with a printed copy of the archive contact's written assessment. Not preliminary, not informal, but a formal document on institutional letterhead, citing specific factory records, correlating the dimensional data with manufacturing specifications, and concluding that the vehicle in question was consistent with the missing development prototype with a degree of certainty that the document described, in the careful language of academic institutions, as high confidence pending physical confirmation of chassis identification. High confidence pending physical confirmation. Logan held the document and read it 3 times. He'd been carrying a feeling for 2 weeks that he couldn't entirely trust his own certainty, not because the evidence was weak, but because the cost of being wrong was real and personal, and would land squarely on him, and by extension, on a 6-year-old girl in a house on Denison Avenue who had appointed herself the custodian of his car magazines. The archive document was the first external confirmation that the feeling and the evidence and the certainty were all pointing at the same thing. He folded the document and put it in his jacket pocket. He slept 4 hours Friday night. The auction floor on Saturday morning was a different environment than the storage floor Logan had spent 2 weeks in. The compound's main hall had been transformed. Tiered seating, a raised auction stage at the far end, high-res displays cycling through lot images, a PA system running low music that was designed to suggest sophistication without demanding attention. Somewhere between 200 and 250 people filled the room, collectors in sports jackets, dealers in groups of 2 or 3, industry press with lanyards and voice recorders, a scattering of enthusiasts who'd paid the registration fee for the experience of being in a room where significant money would change hands. Logan was in the room as floor staff, navy polo, sterling badge, clipboard he didn't need. He had positioned himself at the side of the hall near the corridor that led to the storage floor, where he had a clear sightline to both the stage and the entrance through which the lots would be brought. Arthur Gaines was in the room as well. He'd acquired a registered bidder badge through a contact, legitimate, properly registered. He was seated in the back row with his examination gloves in his jacket pocket and the archive document folded in the same pocket, and the expression of a man who has prepared for this conversation for 15 years. The auction started at 10. Logan watched the first 12 lots go through with the focus of someone who is present at a very ordinary event and whose internal state bears no relationship to that ordinariness. A 1955 Roadster in concours condition opened the bidding and shouted in 4 minutes for a number that made the audience murmur with the specific satisfaction of a crowd that has just been reminded what they came for. A pre-war coupe with racing provenance went to a bidder on the phone who represented a buyer in London. A collection of vintage instruments went as a group lot to a dealer Logan had seen at the preview on Saturday. 11 lots. Efficient, well-run, exactly what a well-run auction looked like. Lot 12. Lot 13. Logan checked his phone. 14 minutes until Lot 47 was scheduled to hit the stage, based on the pace they were running. He looked across the room and found Marcus Reel standing near the far wall. Marcus was in a charcoal suit, watching the auction with the comfortable attention of someone overseeing a process he'd designed and was satisfied with. He had his phone in his hand and was checking it intermittently. Logan looked for the man in the expensive suit, the guest badge from the Friday walkthrough. It took him 3 passes of the room before he found him. Seated in the 4th row, center section, wearing a different suit but recognizable by his build and the same quality of stillness that Logan had noticed the first time. His paddle was number 31. Paddle 31 was going to bid on Lot 47. Logan was certain of it. He looked at the stage, where the auctioneer was moving through Lot 16 with the practiced rhythm of a man who controls the pace of money. He looked at the corridor behind him, where the storage floor crew was staging the next several lots in sequence. He took out his phone and sent Arthur a text. 4th row center, paddle 31. Arthur's reply came back in 30 seconds. I see him. Lot 43. Lot 44. Logan moved from his position at the sidewall to a spot closer to the stage, still floor staff, still holding the clipboard, still invisible in the way that workers in uniform are invisible in rooms full of people who've paid to be there. Lot 45. A 1971 coupe, minor restoration, sold in 3 minutes to a phone bidder. Lot 46. A European import with a complicated history that the auctioneer navigated with practiced care. Logan watched the bids go up in increments, watched the paddles, watched the room's attention flow toward the stage and back. He thought about Hargrove's warning, about Gerald and the clipboard, about what it cost to be wrong in a room full of people who were not going to forgive it. He thought about the piece of paper in his pocket with the chassis number on it, about Arthur's 15 years, about the archive document and the phrase high confidence pending physical confirmation. He thought about Lily on the living room floor asking why old cars had more story in them. Lot 46 closed. The stage crew began bringing Lot 47 through the side entrance. The burned Porsche came into the auction hall on a low rolling dolly, and the sight of it, the ruin of it, the blackened, warped ruin of what had once been something extraordinary, produced a sound in the room that was not exactly amusement, but was close enough to make Logan's jaw tighten. People leaned to their neighbors. A few phones came up to photograph it. The auctioneer said something about the curious appeal of project vehicles that got a small laugh. Lot 47, the auctioneer said, settling into the rhythm. A fire-damaged Porsche 911 body, circa 1970s, offered in as-is condition. This is a project car opportunity for the adventurous buyer. Logan was already moving. He came off the side wall and walked toward the stage with the deliberate pace of a man who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. He didn't run. Running was panic. He walked like someone who belongs in the space he's walking through, which was a thing he'd learned from years of being in rooms where other people didn't think he belonged. The auctioneer saw him coming. Most of the room saw him coming. The crowd registered him the way crowds register unexpected motion. A turning of heads, a ripple of attention, the specific stillness of people who have sensed that something unscheduled is occurring. "I need to stop this sale," Logan said. He said it loudly enough to be heard in the front half of the room, clearly, without the apology that his instincts wanted to insert into it. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence. He was a professional, and professionals in auction rooms are trained for disruptions, but the training was built around bitter disputes and technical issues, not a member of the floor staff walking to the front of the room and declaring a halt. "Sir," the auctioneer said. "This vehicle is misidentified," Logan said. He was at the edge of the stage now, facing not the auctioneer, but the room. 200, and some people looking at him. "The reserve on this lot is $2,200. The car you're about to sell may be worth more than $7 million. The room erupted. Not all at once. It came in a wave, the disbelief first, then the sound of it, conversations breaking out across the tiers, the specific loud confusion of a crowd that has just been told something that cannot simultaneously be true and false and is trying to determine which. Logan heard his name from somewhere to his left, Gerald Potts, moving toward him from the far side of the room with the expression of a man whose clipboard had just become entirely useless. He heard Marcus Reel's voice from somewhere behind the seated crowd. "Security." Logan turned to the burned Porsche on its rolling dolly and crouched beside it. He had brought his tools in his jacket. Small, specific. The flat bar, a magnetic flashlight that he clipped to the frame of the car. He located the edge of the concealment plate. He could find it in the dark now. He'd touched it enough times. And applied the flat bar with the practiced steadiness of someone who has done this precise motion in his head 100 times. The room had not quieted. If anything, it had gotten louder, the confusion compounding itself as people stood to see better, and the people behind them stood to compensate, and suddenly half the audience was on its feet. "Logan," Gerald's hand on his arm. "Logan, you need to—" "Watch," Logan said. Not aggressive, just clear. He worked the flat bar along the seam. The concealment plate shifted, not dramatically. There was no cinematic pop, no flood of light from beneath, none of the things that made moments like this satisfying in the version of events that Logan occasionally imagined when he was being honest with himself about how much he wanted this to go cleanly. The plate moved 8 or 9 millimeters, enough to create a visible gap at one edge, and that was all. It was enough. Logan clipped the flashlight to the frame and angled the beam into the gap. "I need someone to read what they see," Logan said. He said it to the room, to whoever was closest, to the nearest person with eyes and a willingness to look. A man in the front row, heavy set, plaid shirt, the same man Logan had seen at the preview who'd crouched and walked away, stepped forward before Logan fully finished the sentence. He bent and looked into the gap with the immediate focus of someone who understands exactly what he's looking at. He read the numbers aloud. His voice was not loud, but the room had found a different kind of quiet. The quiet of people who understand that something is happening that they will tell other people about. Every word he read was audible. Logan had the piece of paper in his jacket pocket. He didn't need it. He knew the number by memory, had known it since the library 3 weeks ago. He listened to the man in the plaid shirt read each digit, and each digit matched, and when it was done, the match was complete and the room was entirely silent. In the back row, Arthur Gaines stood up. "I can verify that number," Arthur said, loud enough to carry, "against factory records held by the Riemer Automotive Archive in Stuttgart. That chassis identification corresponds to a 1969 factory development prototype that has been missing from the historical record since 1978. He held up the document. "I have a formal written assessment, high-confidence authentication." The silence held for another 2 seconds. Then it broke entirely. Logan stood up from his crouch. His knees ached from the position he'd been in. His hands were not as steady as he would have liked. He looked out at the room, the standing audience, the frozen auctioneer, the press people with their phones now definitely recording, and felt something that wasn't triumph, because triumph was clean and this wasn't clean. This was messy and loud and uncertain in ways that wouldn't resolve for weeks. He looked for Victoria. He found her standing at the back of the stage, to the right of the auctioneer's podium. She was standing completely still in the way that certain people go still under pressure. Not frozen, but collected, all of her attention directed at a single point, calculating. She was looking at Logan. He looked back at her. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the room roared around them, and the burned Porsche sat on its rolling dolly under the auction lights, and held its secret and its value and the decades of someone else's careful concealment in its blackened frame. And Logan held the flat bar in his hand and thought, "This is the part where either everything goes right or I've made the worst mistake of my life." Victoria held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned to the auctioneer and said, clearly and without hesitation, "Stop the auction." The gavel came down, not to close a sale, to close the bidding entirely. Somewhere in the 4th row, paddle 31 went down. Marcus Reel, Logan would notice later, had already left the room. The auction hall took 40 minutes to clear, which was 39 minutes longer than it would have taken under normal circumstances. People didn't want to leave. They stood in clusters, talking, watching the stage where Sterling's operations team had moved quickly to position the burned Porsche behind a temporary barrier. 2 of Victoria's security staff stood at the perimeter with the slightly overwhelmed expressions of people whose job description had not prepared them for this particular Saturday. The press people were the last to go, and they didn't go willingly. A woman with a recorder and a Sterling auto press credential planted herself near the stage barrier and asked Logan 3 questions in rapid succession before Gerald appeared from somewhere and steered him away with a hand on his elbow, and the quiet urgency of a man who understands that whatever is happening is above his authorization level, and he needs to get everyone involved into a room where it can be contained. The room turned out to be a conference room on the 2nd floor that Logan had never been in. Long table, 8 chairs, windows that looked out over the compound's rear lot where the transport vehicles were staged. Gerald left him there with a bottle of water and an instruction to wait, delivered in the tone of a man who is not certain the instruction will be followed and has decided to trust it anyway. Logan sat down. He put the flat bar on the table in front of him. He put Arthur's archive document beside it. He drank some of the water and looked at the window and listened to the muffled sounds of the building reorganizing itself around what had just happened. Arthur arrived 10 minutes later, shown up by Priya, who looked at the flat bar on the table with an expression Logan couldn't entirely read, and then left without saying anything. Arthur sat down across from Logan. He set his copy of the archive document on the table and straightened it with 2 fingers, the habitual precision of a man who organizes his materials the way other people breathe. "You did it," Arthur said. "We don't know what we did yet," Logan said. Arthur looked at him steadily. "The number matched." "I know the number matched. I don't know what happens next." "What happens next," Arthur said, is that they call independent experts, and the experts confirm what we already know, and the car gets pulled from auction and properly authenticated and eventually sold for what it's actually worth. He paused. What happens to you in that process is a different question. Logan looked at the flat bar. Hargrove is going to say I tampered with a lot, Logan said. I touched a vehicle without authorization. I disrupted a legitimate auction. I embarrassed the company in front of 250 registered buyers and at least 6 press people. You prevented a fraud, Arthur said. I don't know that yet, officially. And until I know it officially, I'm the guy who lost his mind on the auction floor and stuck a pry bar in a car that wasn't his. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Are you sorry you did it? He said. Logan thought about it honestly, because Arthur deserved an honest answer. Ask me in a week, Logan said. Victoria came in at 11:40 with a woman Logan didn't recognize. Late 40s, dark suit, the careful, neutral expression of someone in a professional capacity that required her not to have visible reactions. She set a legal pad on the table and introduced herself as the company's general counsel. Her name was Diane Fossey, and she had the focused stillness of a person who had spent decades in rooms where things had gone wrong and had learned to treat that as normal. Victoria sat at the head of the table. She looked at the flat bar and then at Logan. Walk me through exactly what you did, she said, starting from when you walked to the stage. Logan walked her through it. He was precise and complete, the way you are when you're talking to a lawyer, because Diane Fossey was in the room and he understood what that meant. He described the movements, the tool, the plate, the gap, the man in the plaid shirt who'd read the number. He didn't editorialize. He didn't characterize. He laid out the sequence of events as a mechanic describes a repair. Step, step, result. When he finished, Victoria looked at Diane, who made a note. The man who read the number, Victoria said. Do you know who he is? I've seen him at the preview, plaid shirt, heavy set. He looked at the car during preview day and walked away. His name is Robert Fenn, Diane said, without looking up from her notes. He's a collector from Pittsburgh. He's also, it turns out, a former Porsche factory representative. He recognized the significance of what he was looking at immediately. Logan hadn't known that. He filed it away. The archive document, Victoria said. She had Arthur's copy in her hand. She'd been reading it since she sat down. This is from Reamer. Yes, Arthur said. It was the first time he'd spoken since Victoria entered. I've worked with their archive division for 15 years. The correlation between the physical dimensions Logan documented and the factory specifications for the development series is within manufacturing tolerance. The chassis number that Mr. Fenn read confirms the vehicle's identity to a degree of certainty that a full authentication by Reamer's team would elevate to definitive. Victoria set the document down. She looked at Arthur with the kind of attention she'd given it rather than the kind she'd given Logan, which told Logan something about how she categorized information sources. How quickly can Reamer send an authentication team? She said. I can make a call this afternoon, Arthur said. Given the circumstances, I would expect significant interest in expediting. Victoria nodded once. She looked at Diane, who was already making another note. Then Victoria looked at Logan, directly, without the slight distance she'd been maintaining since she sat down. You touched a lot vehicle without authorization, she said. Yes, Logan said. You disrupted an active auction. Yes. After I told you the matter was reviewed. You told me you were thinking about it, Logan said, which I took to mean the decision was still open. The auction wasn't open. It was running. I had minutes. Victoria held his gaze. Her expression was not warm, but it wasn't hostile. It was the expression of someone doing the hard arithmetic of a complicated situation. Marcus Reel left the building, she said. I know, Logan said. I saw him go. A pause. Why do you think he left? She said. Logan looked at her. He thought about how to say the next thing, how much to say, how directly to say it, whether this was the moment or whether there was a version of this conversation that was more careful and more survivable for everyone. He decided to say it directly. Because he knew the car was going to be authenticated, Logan said, and he didn't want to be in the building when that happened. Diane stopped writing. Victoria didn't change expression, but something around her eyes shifted in a way that Logan read as confirmation rather than surprise, as though she'd arrived at the same conclusion hours ago and was now watching someone else walk the same path to the same point. "That's a serious allegation," Diane said, professionally, not dismissively. "I know," Logan said. "I'm not making it casually. The man with the guest badge on the preview Friday, Paddle 31 today, I think he and Marcus had a connection that went past professional. I think the appraisal of Lot 47 was managed to produce a specific result, and I think Marcus was the person managing it." The room was very quiet. Victoria picked up her phone from the table, looked at something on the screen, and set it back down. Whatever was on the screen, she didn't share. "We'll need a full account of your observations," Diane said to Logan. "Written. Everything you saw, everything you heard, every interaction with Marcus and with Hargrove. Dates, times, specific language." "Okay," Logan said. "Today," Diane said. "Okay," Logan said again. Victoria stood. The movement ended the meeting, and everyone in the room understood that without anyone saying so. "Mr. Gaines," she said, "make the call to Reamer." She looked at Logan one more time. "You'll hear from me." She left. Diane gathered her legal pad and followed. Logan and Arthur sat in the empty conference room for a moment. "You'll hear from me," Arthur said. "Do you know what that means?" "Not yet," Logan said. He picked up the flat bar from the table and put it in his jacket pocket. "But I'm still employed. For now." The investigation that unfolded over the next 2 weeks was not the clean, efficient process that institutional investigations looked like from the outside. It was messy and incremental, and produced information in the frustrating sequence of something assembled from pieces rather than revealed all at once. Logan was not the one conducting it. He was interviewed twice, once on the Saturday afternoon by Diane Fossey and a second attorney from the firm, once the following Thursday by an external investigator that Sterling's board had retained. Both times he sat in the conference room on the second floor and answered questions with the complete honesty of a man who understood that his only protection was the truth, because everything else in his position was exposed. He wrote the account Diane had asked for, 8 pages, typed at his kitchen table Sunday morning, specific and dated, and as precise as his memory allowed. He sent it to her email. He did not hear back acknowledging receipt for 3 days, which he spent trying not to interpret as meaningful and mostly failing. He kept working. Gerald, to his credit, didn't pull Logan's schedule, so he appeared every morning, did his assignments, kept his head down, spoke to no one about what was being investigated. The compound had the particular atmosphere of a workplace where something significant has happened, and nobody is quite sure what the eventual shape of it will be. People spoke carefully. Hargrove's team was visibly subdued. Gerald moved through the floor with the expression of a man enduring a weather event he hadn't predicted. Arthur Gaines drove back to Shaker Heights and made his phone call to Reamer. The authentication team arrived from Stuttgart 9 days after the auction, which Arthur described as unprecedented speed in a text message that Logan read 3 times. 3 specialists spent 2 full days with the burned Porsche, properly this time, with authorization, with documentation, with the full exposure of the concealment plate and the identification stamp beneath it. They brought their own equipment and their own records, and they worked with the methodical patience of people for whom being right about something like this carried professional consequences that they took seriously. Logan was not in the building when they worked. He'd been asked to be available but not present, which he understood as the company's way of managing the narrative of the authentication. The result needed to belong to the experts, not to the mechanic who'd been right about it. He accepted that. It was right. The authentication result came on a Wednesday. Logan learned about it from Arthur, who called him at 7 in the evening. "Definitive," Arthur said. The word landed with the weight of 15 years behind it. "Definitive," Logan repeated. The identification stamp matches the factory record. The chassis geometry matches the manufacturing specification. The structural analysis is consistent with the construction methods of the development series in that period. A pause. Logan could hear Arthur exhaling. A long, slow breath. "It's the car, Logan. It's been the car since the moment you looked at it." Logan sat down on his kitchen floor. He wasn't sure why the floor rather than a chair. Sometimes things like that happened. "What's it worth?" he said. "Properly authenticated in the current market with the provenance story attached to it?" Arthur's voice had something in it that wasn't quite professional detachment. "The last comparable sale, a different vehicle from the same development series, less complete provenance documentation, went for 9.4 million at a major European auction 2 years ago." He paused. "This one has a better story." Logan looked at the kitchen ceiling. $9.4 million. He thought about the low-value orange tag, about $2,200 reserve, about Hargrove's 90 seconds and the slight smile and paddle number 31 going down when Victoria called the halt. "Arthur," he said, "yeah, thank you. For all of it. The archive contact, the document, driving out twice. All of it." "I've been looking for that car for 15 years, Arthur said. "Somebody was going to find it eventually. I'm glad it was you." The investigation's conclusions came out in pieces, which was how investigations always worked, not as a single revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of documented facts that eventually resolved into a pattern too clear to deny. Marcus Reel had been the architect of it. The picture that emerged through the external investigators' work was not complicated in structure, though it was careful in execution. Marcus had been in contact with the man from Paddle 31. His name was Terence Volk, and he was a private dealer who operated primarily in European markets, for approximately 8 months before the auction. The connection had started, as these things often do, as a legitimate professional relationship. Volk was a buyer in Sterling's network, Marcus, his point of contact. At some point in the preceding year, that professional relationship had become something else. When the burned Porsche came into the company's inventory through an estate acquisition, Logan never learned the full details of how the car had arrived at Sterling, which was a thread the investigation pulled on but didn't fully resolve. Marcus had recognized something about it. Not what Logan had recognized. Marcus was not a mechanic and had not spent 11 years putting his hands on cars. But he had access to acquisition records, and he had Volk's expertise, and at some point the two of them had understood together what might be sitting in Bay 7 of the compound. What followed was deliberate and patient. Marcus had influenced the assignment of the vehicle to Hargrove's team with enough informality that it was difficult to characterize as an instruction, a suggestion, a comment about the assessment priority queue, a casual observation that fire-damaged vehicles rarely justified deep-dive appraisal time given their market positioning. Hargrove, the investigator found, had no knowledge of the scheme. He had simply done what a man in his position does when the person above him makes the overall direction clear without making it explicit. He'd rid the room and assessed accordingly. The plan had been straightforward. Volk would acquire Lot 47 at the 2,200 reserve, or marginally above if competitive bidding materialized, which was unlikely given the lot's positioning as a curiosity item. The vehicle would then be transferred to Volk's European operation, authenticated through Remmer or a comparable institution, and sold at major auction under proper provenance. The profit on the spread, between 2,200 and 9+ million, would be divided through a structure that Diane's team was still untangling when Logan last heard about it. Logan learned most of this secondhand from Arthur, who knew someone on Diane's team. He was not invited into the process. He was not asked his opinion about what should happen to Marcus. He was a witness and a source of documentation, and after the Thursday interview, he was mostly waiting, which he was not good at, and which he did anyway because there was nothing else to do. What he knew, from the external investigator's report that Victoria shared with staff in summary form 12 days after the auction, Marcus Reel had been terminated. His access to company systems had been revoked immediately following the Saturday event. The matter had been referred to appropriate legal authorities. Terence Volk had apparently become difficult to locate, which Arthur described with the dry observation that people who move cars across international borders for a living tend to have logistical flexibility when they need it. Hargrove was not terminated. This produced mixed feelings in Logan that he examined carefully and decided were valid. Hargrove had been complicit in negligence, but negligence was not conspiracy. He had done what comfortable authority does. He had assumed his first impression was sufficient, had allowed his process to be shaped by the expectations of people above him, and had dismissed a dissenting voice without giving it real consideration. That was a failure. and it was real. But it was a different category of failure from what Marcus had done, and Logan was honest enough with himself to acknowledge the distinction even when the outcome for both was the same burned Porsche nearly sold for nothing. What Hargrove did in the days after the investigation concluded was something Logan hadn't expected. He came to find Logan on the storage floor on a Thursday morning and stood there for a moment without saying anything, in the way of a man who has prepared a speech and lost his confidence in it. "I should have listened," Hargrove said finally. It was 4 words, delivered to a point somewhere past Logan's left shoulder. Not comfortable, not packaged, just the words. Logan looked at him. "Yeah," Logan said. "You should have." Another silence. Hargrove nodded, once the kind of nod that contains more than it shows, and walked away. Logan went back to what he was doing and thought about that for the rest of the morning. He didn't forgive Hargrove. He didn't not forgive him. He filed it in the place where he kept things that were real and complicated and didn't resolve into simple feelings, which was a place that had been getting a lot of use lately. Machim. Victoria found him on a Friday afternoon. Not in a conference room, not through Priya, not with a scheduled 20 minutes. She came to the storage floor herself, in the slacks and gray blazer that seemed to be her default working uniform, and she found him where he usually was, at the staging area, checking a checklist that he had largely memorized but still used because the habit of checking mattered more than whether he needed the reminder. She didn't have her tablet. She didn't have Marcus, because Marcus was gone. She was just herself, which was something Logan was still calibrating his read on after 3 weeks of watching her manage a crisis with the focused control of someone who doesn't permit herself the luxury of visible distress. "Do you have a few minutes?" she said. "I'm on the clock," he said. Then, "Yes." They walked to the far end of the storage floor, which was quieter at this hour. The burned Porsche was no longer in its corner. It had been moved to a secured evaluation area while the authentication process and the legal situation worked themselves out. The space where it had been was empty. Logan noticed that and didn't say anything about it. Victoria stopped at the windows that looked out over the rear lot. She stood there for a moment with her arms crossed and looked at the transport vehicles parked in their rows. "The authentication is complete," she said. "I assume you know." "Arthur told me," Logan said. "Reamer's formal document arrives next week. The board has approved pulling the vehicle from auction pending legal resolution of the acquisition circumstances." She paused. "It may take time. These things do." "I know," Logan said. Victoria turned from the window and looked at him. The direct, undecorated look that he'd gotten used to as being simply how she saw people, without the social softening that most people applied to their attention. "I owe you an apology," she said. Logan waited. He didn't say you don't need to or it's fine, because those would have been the comfortable responses, and she hadn't come down to the storage floor for comfortable. "I had the information you gave me," Victoria said. "I looked at it. I thought about it. And I let myself be convinced by people I trusted that the process was sound." She stopped. "That was my error. Not the process. Not the team. My error." Logan looked at her. "You didn't know about Marcus," he said. "No. But I knew something wasn't adding up, and I let the convenience of the existing assessment override that. You pushed. I didn't push back hard enough." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry. It was a real apology. Not a liability management exercise, not a corporate acknowledgement." Logan had been on the receiving end of enough apologies in his life to know the difference between something that costs the person saying it and something that doesn't. This cost her something. "I appreciate that," he said. She nodded. Then she looked at the window again for a moment, and when she looked back, there was something different in her expression. Not softer exactly, but less governed. "You could have been catastrophically wrong," she said, "on the auction floor. If the number hadn't matched, if Arthur's document hadn't been legitimate, you'd have ended your career in this industry in front of 250 people and a room full of press." "I know," Logan said. "Were you scared?" He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "But being scared didn't change what I knew. It just made knowing it more expensive." Victoria looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. "I've been running this company for 6 years," she said. "I've hired people who looked impressive and turned out to be something else. I've passed on people who didn't look like much and probably should have hired them. She paused. I've been building a team of people who are impressive. I'm not sure I've been building a team of people who are honest. Logan didn't respond to that because it wasn't a question. I want to offer you something, Victoria said. Not because I owe you, although I do, because I think you're actually useful to me. What kind of something? Logan said. A role, she said. Technical Evaluation Director. Every vehicle that comes into this company gets a full assessment from your team before it touches the appraisal queue. You build the standards. You hire the people you need. You answer to me directly. The storage floor was quiet around them. Logan looked at the empty corner where the burned Porsche had been. Why directly to you? He said. Because I don't trust the filter anymore, she said flatly. And because the last time someone tried to tell me something important, they had to walk onto an auction floor and stick a pry bar in a car in front of 250 people to get my attention. She looked at him steadily. I'd prefer a shorter path than that. Logan almost smiled. Not quite. I have conditions, he said. Tell me. Every vehicle gets a full inspection, no exceptions for low-value lots. No appraisal team overriding a technical flag without a documented review, and the standards are public. Inside the company, I mean. Written, distributed, enforced. Not guidelines. Standards. Victoria held his gaze. Anything else? She said. Yeah, Logan said. The man in plaid, Robert Fenn, the one who read the number. He knew what he was looking at immediately. If you're building an evaluation function, you should talk to him. Already on my list, Victoria said. A pause. The salary, she said. She named a number. It was not the number of a person being done a favor. It was the number of a role that was being taken seriously, which was different. Logan looked at the empty corner again. He thought about Lily and the apartment without a second bedroom and the building manager who did not want children and the backward D in crayon on the drawing that his mother had on the refrigerator. He thought about the burned Porsche and what it had looked like coming through the bay doors on a Wednesday afternoon, a ruin that everybody saw through and nobody looked at. He thought about Arthur Gaines in his house in Shaker Heights, surrounded by reference materials, 15 years of looking for something he wasn't sure he'd ever find. I'll need a few days, Logan said. Of course, Victoria said. She left the storage floor the way she'd come in. Efficient, direct, no ceremony. Logan stood at the window for a while after she was gone, looking at the transport vehicles in the rear lot, at the October light on the metal roofs, at the rail corridor in the distance where a freight train was moving slowly west. He called his mother that evening. He told her about the offer. He told her about the salary. He told her about the second bedroom that it would make possible, the building manager who would become irrelevant, the stability that had been a word he'd kept at arm's length for 3 years because letting himself want it fully had felt like an invitation to watch it disappear again. Carol Mercer listened without interrupting, which was the thing she was best at. When he finished, she said, Logan, yeah, take the job. I have conditions, he said. She agreed to them, but take the job, Carol said again, with the particular firmness of a woman who has watched her son carry something heavy for a long time and has decided she's done being patient about it. Logan was quiet for a moment. I'm scared, he said. I know, she said. You can be scared and take it anyway. He drove to Denison Avenue after the call and sat with Lily on the living room floor and looked at the magazines while she talked about the astronaut pancake career plan and the talking fish from her dream and a song she'd learned at school that had a verse she couldn't remember and a chorus she sang 3 times to compensate. He sat with the sound of it around him and thought about a burned car and a pry bar and a room full of people and a number that matched. He thought about how the most important moments of your life rarely announce themselves. They just arrive, looking like everything else. A flatbed truck through a bay door, a Wednesday afternoon, a ruin that nobody wanted. And you either look at it or you don't. He took the job on a Monday. Not because Monday was significant, but because he'd spent the weekend at his mother's house with Lily, and he'd woken up Sunday morning on the couch with a crick in his neck, and Lily sitting cross-legged on the floor 6 inches from his face, watching him sleep with the focused patience of a child who has decided that staring is an acceptable way to communicate urgency. You were making a noise, she informed him. What kind of noise? Like a truck, she said, but quieter. He'd made her pancakes after that, and they'd eaten at the kitchen table while Carol pretended to read the newspaper, and actually watched both of them with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has what she needs in the same room and knows it. And Logan had sat there with his coffee and his crick and his daughter's syrup-sticky fingers reaching across the table to point at things in the paper that interested her. A photograph of a horse, an advertisement with a dog in it, a headline she couldn't read but liked the look of. And he'd thought, this is what I'm doing it for. Not the salary, not the title. This table, this morning, the possibility of more mornings like it, in a place where Lily can have a room with her name on the door. He called Victoria at 9 on Monday morning and said he was accepting. She said, good, come in Wednesday. We'll get the paperwork done and start talking about what the evaluation function needs to look like. Okay, Logan said. One more thing, Victoria said. There was a pause that felt considered rather than hesitant. The announcement to staff, I want to be direct about what happened, what you did, why the role exists. People deserve to understand the connection. Logan thought about that for a moment. He thought about Hargrove and the storage floor and the 250 people in the auction room. He thought about how institutional embarrassment had a way of rewriting itself into something more palatable over time, and how the rewrite always seemed to happen in a direction that benefited the institution. I appreciate that, he said. But keep Hargrove's name out of it. A short silence. Why? Victoria said. Because he was negligent, Logan said. Not criminal. There's a difference. And because if the announcement reads like a public blame assignment, people are going to be thinking about protecting themselves instead of learning anything. He paused. The lesson should be about the standard, not about the people who didn't meet it. Another silence. Longer. Okay, Victoria said. And then, with something in her voice that was close to dry humor, you haven't even started yet, and you're already adjusting my communication strategy. I'm adjusting it once, Logan said. Then I'll stick to cars. The paperwork took most of Wednesday, which Logan spent in Diane Fossey's office signing documents that he read carefully rather than skimming, because Diane had told him to read them carefully, and he'd decided that Diane was the kind of person whose professional advice was worth taking seriously. He came out of it with a contract, a benefits package, and the slightly disoriented feeling of a man who had walked into a building 4 weeks ago as temporary labor and was now signing documents that described him as a director-level employee with a departmental budget and direct reporting access to the CEO. He drove home and sat in his truck in the parking lot of his apartment building and stayed there for 20 minutes without getting out. Not because anything was wrong. Just because the shape of his life had changed significantly in a short period of time, and his nervous system needed a moment to register that the change was real and was going in a direction he actually wanted rather than a direction that was happening to him. He thought about Claire, who was Lily's mother, who had left 3 years ago for reasons that were complicated, and that Logan had mostly stopped trying to reduce to a simple narrative, because the simple narrative always made one of them the villain, and he didn't think the actual story was that clean. Claire had loved him. He'd loved her. They'd been bad at being together in ways that neither of them had seen coming, and both of them had felt coming for a long time before they named it. She lived in Columbus now. She called Lily on Sundays and sent cards on birthdays and holidays, and she was not a bad person. She was a person who had made the choice she could live with, and Logan had spent a long time being angry about that and a shorter but harder time understanding it. What he'd learned in the 3 years since was that you could be the primary parent of a 6-year-old and a full-time mechanic and a person still working out who you were without the structure of someone else's companionship to lean on, all at the same time, and that none of it killed you, even when it felt like it might. That knowledge wasn't comfortable, but it was real. And real things had a kind of weight that comfortable things didn't. He got out of the truck and went inside and started looking at apartment listings. The technical evaluation department of Sterling Auto was built from nothing, which was the part of the job that Logan hadn't fully anticipated, and which turned out to be both the hardest and the most satisfying thing he'd done professionally. Building a function from scratch meant defining everything. What a complete vehicle assessment looked like, what documentation was required, what the escalation process was when a technical finding conflicted with an existing appraisal, what happened when a buyer's representative pushed back on a condition finding and wanted a different result. That last one was where he expected the most friction, and it was where he got it. The collector car world operated on relationships and reputations and the quiet, accumulated authority of men who had been doing things a certain way for a long time. Logan was 32 years old and had spent the past decade in a mechanic's shop, and his arrival in a director-level position at Sterling had not been universally welcomed by the industry contacts and long-standing buyers who considered themselves part of the company's established culture. He had a difficult meeting in his third week with a buyer's group representative, a man named Southall, late 50s, who had been acquiring vehicles through Sterling for 12 years, and who made it clear within the first 5 minutes of their conversation that he considered Logan's new role an overcorrection to a one-time problem and that he expected the assessment process to function with the same flexibility it had always had. Flexibility, Logan said. We have relationships, Southall said. There's a way these things work, a condition finding on a vehicle that affects the reserve. That's a conversation, not a ruling. It's a ruling, Logan said. Southall looked at him steadily. You're new here. I am, Logan said. The standards aren't new, though. They're written down. You got a copy last week. Standards are guidelines, Southall said. At this company, Logan said, they're standards, which is why they're called standards and not guidelines. It was not a warm meeting. Southall left without the accommodation he'd come for. Logan spent the afternoon wondering if the call to Victoria would come that day or the next day, because men like Southall always made the call, and the call was always framed as concern for the company's relationships rather than concern about the person who'd refused to accommodate them. The call came the next morning. Victoria called Logan, not the other way around. Southall reached out, she said. I figured, Logan said. He said you were inflexible. I was, Logan said. His ask was that a condition finding be treated as a starting point for negotiation rather than a documented assessment. I told him it wasn't. A pause. He's been a buyer here for 12 years, Victoria said. His group accounts for about 3% of annual transaction volume. I know, Logan said. Is that a problem? Another pause. Longer. No, Victoria said. I'm telling you so you understand what you're working with, not telling you to change your answer. Logan exhaled slowly. He'll come back, Logan said. They always come back if the inventory is good, and the inventory will be good because we'll actually know what we have. That's the theory, Victoria said. That's the plan, Logan said. There's a difference. He could hear something in her silence that might have been amusement. It was difficult to tell with Victoria. She expressed things in small movements rather than large ones, which Logan had started to understand was not restraint, but precision. She said exactly what she meant, and nothing that she didn't, and in a world full of people who used more words than they needed, that economy was occasionally hard to read. Southall will be fine, she said finally. Keep going. Robert Fenn turned out to be one of the best decisions the department made. Victoria had put Logan in contact with him the week after the auction, and Logan had driven to Pittsburgh on a Saturday to meet him in the garage behind his house, where Fenn kept his own collection. 3 vehicles, none of them flashy by collector standards, all of them significant in ways that required knowing what you were looking at to appreciate. They'd spent 4 hours in that garage talking about vehicles and provenance and the particular dishonesty of a market that assigned value based on surface presentation rather than mechanical truth, and by the end of it, Logan had offered him a consulting role that Fenn had accepted with the enthusiasm of a man who has spent 20 years being the only person in the room who actually understood what he was looking at. Fenn was not easy. He was opinionated and occasionally combative, and had strong views about the correct way to approach a vehicle assessment that did not always align with Logan's strong views about the correct way to approach a vehicle assessment. They argued about methodology with a regularity that the rest of the department treated as ambient noise, the background sound of the evaluation function working out its own internal logic. What Fenn was, underneath the opinion and the combativeness, was honest. Ruthlessly, sometimes inconveniently honest, in the way that people are when they care more about getting things right than about being liked. Logan recognized that quality because he'd been told he had it himself, usually by people who were not entirely pleased about it. He built the team slowly over the first 3 months, 4 full-time evaluators, each with a specific area of expertise, each hired not primarily for credentials, but for the thing that credentials sometimes produced and sometimes didn't: the ability to look at a vehicle without a conclusion already formed and tell you what was actually there. He instituted a documentation protocol that required every assessment to be written, dated, signed, and stored in a system that was accessible to Victoria's office at any time. He built in a second evaluation requirement for any vehicle with a flagged discrepancy: 2 independent assessments before anything went to the appraisal team. It was not, he was honest with himself, a perfect system. It was a system built by a person who was learning how to build systems with the limitations that implied. There were gaps in the first version that the first 3 months of actual operation exposed and that the next revision addressed. There would be gaps in the revision too. The difference between a good process and a bad one, he was coming to understand, was not that the good one had no flaws. It was that the good one had a mechanism for finding its own flaws and correcting them. He put that in writing too: standards for standards. The meta-document that described how the evaluation framework itself would be reviewed and updated on a defined cycle. Gerald Potts, who had somehow ended up as the administrative anchor of the new department, a role that no one had explicitly offered him, but which he had drifted into with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows where he's useful. Read the meta-document and then looked at Logan with an expression that contained, somewhere inside its usual clipboard and checklist neutrality, something that might have been respect. "You thought about all of this," Gerald said. "Not all of it," Logan said. "About half of it. The rest I'm figuring out as it breaks." "That's more than most people do," Gerald said. "But yeah." The Porsche sold in the spring. Not through Sterling. The legal situation with the acquisition had complicated the company's ability to sell it directly, and Diane Fossey had recommended a structured process that placed the vehicle with an independent authentication partner who then brokered the sale through a major European auction. Logan was not involved in that process. He heard about it from Arthur. The sale price was $11.2 million. Arthur sent a text message with the number and nothing else, which was exactly the right way to deliver that particular piece of information. Logan read it at his desk in the new office. He had an office now, a small one off the evaluation floor, with a window that looked into the assessment bays where his team worked, and sat with it for a while. $11.2 million for a burned Porsche that had been assigned a $2,200 reserve. He thought about all the variables that had put those two numbers in proximity to each other. The estate that had sold it without knowing what they had, the shipping company that had delivered it on a flatbed with indifferent efficiency, the assessment process that had allocated 90 seconds to it, the scheme that had been designed to exploit every one of those variables in sequence. And a Wednesday afternoon. A flatbed dolly through a bay door. A feeling in his stomach that he hadn't known how to name but had refused to ignore. He thought about what it meant that any one of those variables could have gone differently. If he'd been assigned to a different part of the floor that day. If Lily hadn't asked why old cars had more story in them, which had been turning over in his head when he'd gone back to look the first time. If Arthur Gaines had been less rigorous with his 15 years of research, or less willing to drive from Shaker Heights twice for a man he'd met on an internet forum. Things that happen have the quality of inevitability, in retrospect, that they never have in the moment. In the moment, they're just contingent, a sequence of choices made by imperfect people under incomplete information, any of which could have gone a different direction. Logan found that he didn't want to think about the near-miss version of it, the version where he'd let Gerald's gentle redirect be enough, where he'd accepted Hargrove's warning as wisdom instead of pressure, where he'd convinced himself that being right wasn't sufficient justification for being difficult. He thought about that version, and then he set it down, because there was no use carrying it. The version that had actually happened was the one he had to live in. He called Arthur. 11-2, Arthur said when he picked up. 11-2, Logan said. A comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. What happens to it now? Logan asked. The buyer is a private foundation in Switzerland, Arthur said. They've committed to a full restoration and eventual museum display. The car will be documented, properly this time, and its history will be part of the public record. He paused, including how it was found. You'll write that up? Logan said. Already started, Arthur said. I'd like to include your account. if you're willing. Logan thought about it. Include what matters about the car, Logan said. The rest is just a story about a mechanic being stubborn. That's the part people will actually read, Arthur said. The apartment on Fulton was on the third floor of a building that had been renovated sometime in the previous decade by someone with genuine attention to detail rather than the minimum necessary to satisfy the building code. The floors were original hardwood, sanded and refinished. The windows were large. There were 2 bedrooms, both of reasonable size, and a kitchen with enough counter space that you could cook a real meal without moving things to the stove to make room. Logan had looked at 11 apartments before he found it. He'd had a list of requirements and a budget and the disciplined patience of a man who understood that getting this particular decision wrong was not an option, because this decision was not about him. The second bedroom was Lily's bedroom, and Lily's bedroom needed to be right. He moved in on a Saturday in late November with the help of his brother Dennis, who complained about the stairs the entire time and would not accept any offer of compensation other than pizza, and Carol, who directed operations from the ground floor with the authority of a woman who has moved enough furniture in her life to have strong opinions about methodology. Lily came with them. She had opinions about which box went where that she expressed continuously and which Dennis ignored and Logan tried to implement approximately 60% of the time, which Lily accepted as an adequate rate of compliance. They set up Lily's room last. Logan had bought the furniture in pieces, a bed frame, a small dresser, a bookshelf, and assembled it the previous week in the middle of his own mostly empty apartment because he'd wanted it to be done when she arrived. The room had a window that looked out over a quiet street with a maple tree that still had some of its late-season leaves, orange and brown, in the November light. Lily stood in the doorway of the room and looked at it. She didn't say anything for a moment, which was unusual enough that Logan paid attention to it. "It's mine?" she said. "It's yours," Logan said. She walked in. She stood in the middle of the room and turned around slowly, looking at all 4 walls, at the window, at the bookshelf that Logan had already put 3 of her books on because he'd known she'd be looking for them. She walked to the window and looked out at the maple tree. "The leaves are falling off," she said. "They do that in the fall," Logan said. "They come back in the spring." "How do they know when to come back?" "They just do," Logan said. "The tree knows." Lily considered this, then she nodded, with the seriousness she applied to most things, and turned around and looked at Logan. "I like it," she said. It was not a dramatic statement. She said it the way she said most things, straightforwardly, without the performance of feeling. But Logan felt it land with the particular weight of something he'd been working toward for 3 years without always being certain he was moving in the right direction. He said, "Good." Then he went back to the living room before his face did something embarrassing, and his brother Dennis handed him a piece of pizza and said nothing about any of it, which was the most useful thing Dennis had done all day. Victoria invited him to a board presentation in January, his first, as a department head. He stood in a conference room considerably larger and more formal than the one on the second floor where he'd first told Diane Fossey about the concealment plate, and he walked 12 board members through the evaluation department's first quarter results. The numbers told a story that Logan had watched develop in real time, but still found striking in aggregate. 14 vehicles identified with condition discrepancies that the previous assessment process would have missed or minimized, 2 of which had significant provenance questions that, when properly investigated, revealed documentation gaps that affected lot valuation materially. 0 assessment-related complaints from buyers, which was not 0 complaints because buyers always had complaints, but 0 that related to the technical condition documentation, which was the category that mattered, and a buyer retention rate that had not declined, which was the metric that Sothal's phone call had implicitly threatened. He presented this without the performed confidence that he'd seen other people bring to rooms like this, the practiced certainty that was really just certainty about the presentation rather than the substance. He talked about where the system had worked and where it hadn't. He described the gap in the first version protocol that he'd found in month 2 and the revision that had addressed it. He said the next quarter would surface more gaps, and those would be addressed too. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Kwan, who had the expression of someone whose default setting was skepticism and who considered this a feature rather than a problem, said, "You're telling us what's not working." "I'm telling you everything," Logan said. Most department heads tell us what's working, she said. I know, Logan said, but you're the board. If I'm filtering what I tell you, you can't do your job. And if you can't do your job, I can't do mine. A short silence. Quan looked at Victoria, who was seated at the far end of the table with her tablet and her coffee, and an expression that conveyed nothing in particular. I like him, Quan said to Victoria, as though Logan were not present. I know you would, Victoria said. Listen, he and Victoria did not have a simple relationship, which was fine, because neither of them was a simple person. They disagreed regularly about the evaluation budget, about the speed of the rollout for the new documentation system, about a particular vendor that Logan thought was overcharging for condition assessment software and that Victoria had a pre-existing relationship with. These disagreements were conducted directly and concluded without lingering resentment, which Logan appreciated because he'd worked for enough people whose authority was so fragile that any challenge to it became personal. What he discovered about Victoria over months of proximity was that the precision and efficiency that read as coldness from a distance was not coldness. It was the way someone organized themselves when they'd learned early that being undisciplined was expensive. She'd built the company from a regional operation in her mid-20s. Logan eventually learned the details, not from Victoria, but from an old trade publication profile that Arthur sent him for reasons that weren't entirely clear. And the discipline that had made that possible had calcified into a style that people sometimes mistook for the absence of feeling. She cared about the company with the specific intensity of someone who had made it themselves rather than inherited it. She cared about getting things right in a way that had been genuinely damaged by what Marcus had done. Not just the fraud, but the implied judgment that her trust had been weaponized by someone who had been in her inner circle for 4 years. Logan saw that damage in the particular care she now took about who got access to what. The slightly longer pauses before she delegated significant decisions. The way she occasionally overcommunicated on things she would previously have handled with a 2-line email. He didn't comment on it, it wasn't his place and it wasn't his damage. But he understood it because he recognized the behavior of someone who had trusted and been wrong, and was now quietly rebuilding the calibration. He recognized it because he'd done it himself, after Claire. In March, he took Lily to a car show for the first time. It was a regional event, not the major collector shows that the industry ran in the summer. A mid-sized gathering in a convention center in Akron, maybe 400 vehicles, a mix of classics and muscle cars, and the occasional European sports car that someone had driven 3 hours to show and would drive 3 hours back. The kind of event that the serious collector world didn't consider significant, and that Logan had always loved precisely because of that. Because the people who brought their cars here did it because they wanted to, not because the market demanded it. Lily walked through it with the focus of someone conducting a survey. She asked questions about every car that interested her, which was most of them, and she had no framework for which questions were significant and which were naive, which meant she asked all of them with equal seriousness. She asked the owner of a 1967 Mustang Fastback why it was that color. She asked the woman who'd brought a 1958 Thunderbird how it felt to drive something that old. She asked the man with the pre-war British Roadster whether it was hard to get parts. That last question made the man, 60-something, gray beard, the permanent mild sunburn of someone who spent his weekends outdoors, look at her with genuine delight. How old are you? He asked. 6 3/4, Lily said. And you know what parts are? My dad's a mechanic, Lily said. He knows everything about cars. The man looked at Logan. She's right, Logan said. Mostly. They walked for 3 hours. Lily got tired near the end and Logan carried her for the last section, which she accepted with the dignity of a person who has decided that physical fatigue is not a moral failing. She fell asleep in the truck on the way back, her head against the window, the seatbelt across her in the careful configuration that Logan had triple-checked before he pulled out of the parking lot because he triple-checked everything. He drove back to Cleveland through the March afternoon with his sleeping daughter and the radio low and thought about the burned Porsche and the library database and Arthur's 15 years and the number that had matched. He thought about what it meant that a ruined thing could hold its own identity through decades of concealment and fire and deliberate misrepresentation and still be exactly what it was when someone finally looked at it properly. He thought about Lily, who was 6 3/4 and knew what parts were, and asked every question that occurred to her with the calm certainty that the question deserved an answer. He He thought about who she was going to be in 10 years, in 20, in the years he couldn't see yet. He thought about how much of that was already present, already there, already her. The seriousness and the curiosity and the stubborn insistence on asking the question directly rather than the polite version of it. He thought about what it meant to be the parent of a person like that. It meant you had to be the kind of person she could point at honestly. It meant you couldn't take shortcuts on the things that were actually important and tell yourself the shortcuts were practical. It meant you had to be willing to walk onto an auction floor with a pry bar and say the thing directly, even when the room wasn't ready for it, because the alternative was standing there knowing the truth and saying nothing, and there was a 6-year-old girl somewhere who was watching what that looked like. Not watching from the room, just watching in the way that children watch, absorbing the pattern of who you are rather than the specific events of your life. He didn't want to be the pattern of someone who knew better and stayed quiet. Victoria called him into her office in April, which she did periodically for operational discussions that didn't need a formal meeting structure. He'd been in the office enough times by then that it had stopped feeling like a principal's office and started feeling like a workspace, which was what it was, which was also what Victoria's office always had been, and the distinction had mostly been in his own head. She had a cup of coffee for him, which was a gesture she made occasionally, and which Logan had learned to read as a signal that the conversation was going to be longer than the agenda suggested. "I had a call from the Whitmore Group yesterday," she said. The Whitmore Group was a major collector organization, one of the largest private collector networks in the country, based in Chicago. They ran their own acquisitions and their own assessments, and their reputation in the market was significant enough that their endorsement of a vehicle's provenance could move its value materially. "What did they want?" Logan said. "They've been watching what we've been doing with the evaluation function," Victoria said. "Apparently the word about the Porsche, and what came after, has circulated more than I realized." She picked up her coffee cup and set it down without drinking from it, which Logan recognized by now as the gesture of a person thinking something through rather than avoiding the topic. "They want to license the assessment framework." Logan looked at her. "License it," he said. "Adapt it for their acquisitions process. They'd pay for the documentation, the methodology, the training protocol, and they'd attribute it, publicly, to Sterling Auto's evaluation department." The office was quiet. Logan looked at the window, the same view of the compound's rear lot, the transport vehicles in their rows, the rail corridor in the distance. He thought about the first document he'd written, the 8 pages at his kitchen table, the account of what he'd seen, drafted on a Sunday morning with the urgency of someone who understands that the only thing standing between the truth and its disappearance is the act of writing it down. He thought about the standards document and the meta document and the first version protocol that had been revised when it broke and the second version that would be revised when it broke too. He thought about Robert Fenn in his Pittsburgh garage and Arthur Gaines in his Shaker Heights house full of reference materials and Gerald Potts with his clipboard, who had tried in his limited way and who had stayed in the building after everything and had become, in his quiet and unglamorous way, essential. "That's good for the company," Logan said. "It is," Victoria said. "It's also good for the industry. If the standard becomes the expectation rather than the exception, then the next burned Porsche gets found," Logan said, "before someone sells it for $2,000. "Yes," Victoria said. A pause. "You should negotiate the licensing terms carefully," Logan said. "The framework has to stay intact. They can't adapt it in ways that compromise the core requirement. Every vehicle, full assessment, documented. If they dilute that, the attribution isn't worth having." Victoria looked at him. "I was going to ask if you wanted to be in the negotiation," she said. "Yes," Logan said. "I thought so," she said. Oh. Summer arrived the way Cleveland summers do. Not gradually, but all at once. The gray of April replaced almost overnight by heat and light, and the particular quality of sky that made the lake visible in the distance from high points in the city. Logan drove Lily to his mother's house on a Saturday in June, the route he'd driven hundreds of times, past the houses with their porch lights that would come on in the evening, past the corner store where he used to buy candy as a kid, past the lot where a building had stood when he was small, and where there was now nothing but grass and a chain-link fence. Carol made coffee, and they sat on the porch while Lily played in the backyard with the focused intensity of a child who has been given space and has an imagination that fills it immediately. They could hear her narrating something to herself for a game, a story, a sequence of events that had its own internal logic and required no audience. "She's good," Carol said. "She's great," Logan said, and then, "She's going to be something." Carol looked at him with the slight smile of a woman who is not going to say "I told you so" because she considers it beneath her, but who is also clearly thinking it. "You're good too," Carol said. Logan drank his coffee. "I'm working on it," he said. "You always say that," Carol said. "Because it's always true," Logan said. Carol looked at the backyard where Lily was now explaining something at length to a bee that was investigating a patch of clover near the fence. The explanation appeared to be detailed and serious, and the bee appeared to be unpersuaded. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Carol said, "if you'd just let it go? The car. If you'd listened to Gerald the first time." Logan thought about it. He gave it the honest consideration it deserved. "I think about what it cost me not to let it go," he said. "Those 3 weeks in between, the waiting, the warnings, going back every night, that wasn't fun." He paused. "But I don't think about whether I should have done it differently. That part I don't second guess." "Why not?" He watched Lily crouch down near the clover patch, very close to the bee now, examining it with her characteristic seriousness. "Because the car was there," he said, "and I could see it. And there's a version of me that looks away from things he can see because the looking is inconvenient, and I don't like that version very much." He drank his coffee. "I don't want Lily to grow up around that version." Carol was quiet for a moment. "Your father was like that," she said. "He couldn't look away from things either. It cost him sometimes." "I know," Logan said. "He didn't think it was a cost," Carol said. "He thought it was just being who you were, not a virtue, just a fact." Logan thought about that. About whether the distinction his mother was drawing mattered. Whether the thing he'd done on the auction floor was courage, or just stubbornness, or just the inevitable output of being built a certain way, the way a car is built to certain specifications and behaves accordingly under load. He thought maybe the distinction didn't matter as much as the thing itself, the doing of it, the standing in the room and saying the thing directly and accepting what came after. Lily looked up from the bee and saw him watching her. She waved. He waved back. Hug. There is something this story keeps returning to, underneath all the auction rooms and the evidence and the mechanics of what Logan found and how he found it. It's not really about the car. The car is just the object that made the other things visible. It's about the particular human experience of knowing something that the people around you have decided not to know. Of being certain about something that the room needs to be uncertain about in order to function comfortably. Of being the person who, not because of courage or heroism or any of the qualities that make for a cleaner story, simply cannot bring himself to look away from a thing he can see. Most people in Logan's position let it go. Not because they're bad people, because the cost of not letting it go is real and personal and immediate, and the cost of letting it go is diffuse and abstract and can be rationalized into something that doesn't feel like a failure. This is not a criticism of most people. It's a description of how human beings are built and how institutions take advantage of that design. What Logan had, underneath the mechanical knowledge and the restoration experience and the library research, was something simpler and harder to name. He genuinely could not make himself be comfortable with the wrong version of the truth, not as a moral position, not as a policy, just as a fact about himself. The same way a car has a particular tolerance for heat or load. You can push it. It won't give. That's just what it is. That quality does not always lead to good outcomes. There are people built the same way who end up stubborn and isolated and correct about things nobody ever validates because they never found a room where the truth they were carrying was the right one for the moment. Logan got lucky. The burned Porsche was the real thing. Arthur Gaines had 15 years of research that said so. The number matched. But even if it hadn't, even if the number had been wrong, the plate had been blank, the car had been exactly the late 70s wreck that Hargrove's team had called it, Logan would still have been the person who went to look, who went back to look again, who worked through the nights and drove to the library and called a retired historian at 4 in the morning because the feeling in his stomach wouldn't let him leave it alone. That's the part that can't be taught. The knowledge can be taught. The process can be taught. The documentation and the standards and the assessment protocols, all of that is teachable. And Logan spent the better part of that first year teaching it. But the willingness to be the inconvenient person in the room, to stay with the thing you know when everyone around you has moved on, that comes from somewhere else. It comes from the accumulated decision, made and remade across years, to be the version of yourself that doesn't look away. Lily came across the yard and climbed the porch steps and sat down next to Logan on the top step and leaned against his arm with the uncomplicated ease of a person who has decided that this is a good place to be. "The bee left," she said. "Where'd it go?" "I don't know. It just went." She thought about it. "Maybe it found something better." "Maybe," Logan said. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her and looked at the backyard. The clover patch, the fence, the afternoon light going long and gold across the grass. He thought about a burned car in a corner of a storage floor, and all the distances between that moment and this one, and the various versions of himself that had existed in between. The uncertain version, and the stubborn version, and the version that had walked onto an auction floor not knowing if he was right and done it anyway. He thought about the things that get buried, the things that go missing from the record for 40 years, and end up in the corner of a warehouse with an orange tag on them and a wrong number on the placard. The things that hold their identity through everything that's done to conceal it, waiting for someone to look at them honestly. He thought about what it meant to find something like that, to bring it back into the light. Some things are worth looking for, even when the looking is hard, even when the room has already decided otherwise, even when you're the only person with a flashlight and a flat bar and a feeling in your stomach that you don't know how to name but can't bring yourself to ignore. Real value is patient. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. And sometimes, if you're the kind of person who can't look away from things you can see, it waits for you specifically. The afternoon light went gold across the grass. Lily leaned against her father's arm. The maple tree on Fulton Street was 3 months from turning orange and was already, probably, deciding how to do it. Some things know when to come back. The tree knows.